Hello fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. Take a breath, slow down, this space was made for you. Some people use these stories to drift into sleep, others keep them playing while cooking, driving or working with headphones on. However you're here, you're part of a small community of curious humans who choose calm knowledge over noise. We don't shout answers we don't have. This is soft science, humble storytelling, and a reminder that it's okay not to know everything. If you drift off halfway through, timestamps in the description let you return tomorrow. If you value this kind of long-form history, liking and subscribing isn't just for the algorithm. It quietly tells me that these hours matter to you and helps more sleepless sapiens find them. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Tonight we follow the trail of a predator that lived until the very end. 67 million years ago, in the very last stretch of the Cretaceous, Patagonia was not the silent, windswept land it is today. It was green, seasonal, and alive with rivers that snaked through plains of ferns and conifers. Titanosaurs, the great long-necked sauropods, still moved heavily across the floodplains. Crocodiliforms lurked in the shallows. And in this ecosystem, balanced on the edge of oblivion, there prowled a hunter that the world almost forgot. When people think of the final chapter of the dinosaurs, they think of Tyrannosaurus rex, the northern giant of North America. But far to the south, in what is now Argentina, another lineage held its ground. It was not a tyrannosaur, though it shared some of their traits. It was not an allosaur, though it still carried echoes of that older dynasty. It was something else entirely, a predator shaped by its own history of isolation and evolution. The question is, who were these last predators of the South, and what can they tell us about how the story of the dinosaurs ended? The picture we have today is clearer than it was even a decade ago, thanks to a set of bones preserved in Patagonia's rocks from the very end of the Maastrichtian age. These fossils reveal a predator that stalked prey until just before the asteroid struck 66 million years ago. For North America, the final act is dominated by Tyrannosaurus, with its massive head and famously tiny arms. For South America, it is now increasingly clear that the ecological top tier was held by Megaraptorids, a lineage with enormous claws, long arms, and a body plan that looks almost like an inversion of the Tyrannosaur strategy, where the Tyrannosaurs grew stronger skulls and jaws while their arms shrank into little more than balance rods. The Megaraptorids lengthened their arms and refined their claws into formidable weapons. They represent a parallel path to predation at the close of the age of dinosaurs. The discovery of a new species, now named Joaquinraptor casali, has given us one of the clearest windows yet into this group at the very moment before their extinction. The rocks that entombed it lie in the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 Formation in Patagonia, dated securely to the final slice of the late Cretaceous. This means that when an asteroid just over 10 kilometers wide crashed into the Yucatan Peninsula, and fire, darkness and climate collapse swept the world, Joaquinraptor was alive. It may have hunted just days, weeks, or years before that impact drew a line across Earth's biological history. For paleontologists, this is not just another fossil. It is a bookmark on the last page of the dinosaur era in South America. What kind of predator was this animal? To imagine it, you need to strip away the idea that all giant predators looked and acted like tyrannosaurs. In Patagonia, ecosystems had their own cast of characters. The titanosaurs there were among the last of their kind, still persisting in herds where in North America they had largely dwindled. Crocodiliforms filled niches broader than their modern relatives. The climate was seasonal but warmer than today, with wet and dry periods that shaped vegetation. And across this stage moved a hunter perhaps 7 meters long, equipped not only with serrated teeth, but also with forelimbs powerful enough to wield scythe-like claws. It was neither the blunt force predator of the north, nor the lean pursuit hunters of earlier Jurassic landscapes. Instead, it was something in between, combining speed, armament, and intelligence in a balance we are only beginning to understand. For decades, scientists debated what Megaraptors even were. Some thought they were giant relatives of Allosaurs, holdovers of an older lineage. Others argued they were linked to Coelurosaurs, closer to the group that eventually produced birds. More recently, evidence has tied them to Tyrannosauroids, making them southern cousins of T-Rex rather than distant strangers. If this is correct, then the story of the end of the Cretaceous was not just one predator line ruling everywhere. It was a split history. In the north, tyrannosaurs grew massive heads and crushing jaws. In the south, their kin took another route, enlarging their arms, keeping their claws sharp and filling the same top predator role in a different way. Evolution does not produce the same solutions everywhere, even when facing similar ecological pressures. It improvises, it experiments. Patagonia's last predator is proof of that. The fossil record of Megaraptors is frustratingly fragmentary. Most of what we knew until recently came from isolated claws, ribs, or vertebrae. That made it hard to place them confidently on the dinosaur family tree, and harder still to understand what they looked like in life. Joaquinraptor changes that, because it is among the most complete specimens yet recovered. Even before we examine the details of its bones, its mere existence so late in time confirms something important. Megaraptorids did not vanish earlier in the Cretaceous. They lasted until the very end, until the skies darkened, until the plants withered, until the seas acidified. They were not side characters, they were main predators standing shoulder to shoulder with T-Rex in the final countdown. This sets up a striking contrast between hemispheres. Imagine standing on the shores of late Cretaceous Patagonia 66 million years ago. If you looked north, across continents you would find tyrannosaurs locked in dominance. If you stayed in the south, you would find megaraptors filling the same ecological space, but doing it differently. It is like two versions of the same story being written at the same time with different alphabets. Both stories ended abruptly with the same punctuation mark, an asteroid impact. But the sentences leading up to that mark were not the same, and that divergence tells us something about evolution. It tells us that multiple paths can lead to top predator status. It tells us that dominance is not a single blueprint. It tells us that chance, geography, and lineage history shape the outcome just as much as universal rules. So when we ask what predator was roaming Patagonia when the asteroid approached, the answer is not a simple name but a broader realization. It was a Megaraptorid, a giant hunter with claws as its signature weapon. It was Joaquinraptor casali, newly discovered and finally giving flesh to a ghost lineage we suspected but never fully saw. It was one of the last of its kind, living in a world that was about to end. And perhaps the haunting question left behind is this: if the asteroid had missed, would the age of Megaraptors have continued? Would Patagonia have seen their line grow larger, stranger, more specialized, as the northern tyrannosaurs did? We will never know. What we do know is that for a brief time, as the world tilted toward catastrophe, Patagonia belonged to them. When the first bones of Megaraptors were pulled from the ground in the late 1990s and early 2000s, paleontologists knew they were looking at something strange. The claws were massive, curved, and sharp enough to belong to the hands of a nightmare. The proportions of the forelimbs suggested strength and agility, not the vestigial weakness of tyrannosaurs, and yet the teeth were narrow, blade-like, and more reminiscent of other predatory clades. From the very start, the fossils seemed to refuse easy classification. Scientists tried to fit them into the frameworks they already had. Were they relics of the great Allosaur lineage, survivors of a Jurassic dynasty? Or were they an unusual branch of the Tyrannosauroids, southern cousins of the northern giants? Or were they something else altogether, a ghost clade of predators that had simply been overlooked until now? The confusion was not just an academic squabble. Taxonomy is how paleontologists make sense of deep time. It is the scaffolding that lets us trace evolutionary paths and compare ecosystems separated by continents. If you misplace an animal on the tree of life, you misinterpret the entire branch it hangs from. And Megaraptors, with their handful of scattered fossils, forced researchers into decades of second-guessing. The debates of the early 2000s reveal how fragile our knowledge of the deep past can be when based on incomplete remains. At first, the discovery of Megaraptor 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 in Patagonia was interpreted as evidence of an enormous clawed predator closely related to dromaeosaurs, the group that includes Velociraptor. The immense claw on the hand looked so much like a scaled-up version of the infamous sickle claw of smaller raptors that the name Megaraptor seemed obvious. For a time, textbooks and popular accounts described it as a giant raptor, an oversized cousin of the pack hunters that had captured public imagination. But as more material came to light, this interpretation began to crumble. The claw was not from the foot at all, but from the hand. This single reinterpretation shifted the entire reconstruction of the animal. It was not a scaled-up velociraptor, it was something else entirely. This kind of misstep is not uncommon in paleontology. Fossils are often fragmentary, broken and distorted by millions of years of geological pressure. A single bone, misplaced in interpretation, can send the narrative down a misleading path for years. The early debates over Megaraptors are a classic case of this. Once it was realised that the claws belonged to the hand, not the foot, the resemblance to dromaeosaurs weakened, and researchers began to look for other affinities. Some suggested Megaraptors were Allosauroids, part of the group that had dominated the Jurassic but was thought to have dwindled by the end of the Cretaceous. This idea made intuitive sense. Allosaurs were known for relatively large forelimbs compared to Tyrannosaurs, and perhaps Megaraptors were a late surviving offshoot of that dynasty in Gondwana. For a while, this hypothesis held sway. It neatly explained the clawed arms and some of the skeletal features, but the more the fossils were scrutinised, the more cracks appeared in the theory. By the mid-2000s, alternative interpretations began to circulate. Some researchers argued that Megaraptors were not Allosaurs at all, but members of the Coelurosaurs, the diverse group that includes tyrannosaurs and birds. This would place them much closer to the lineage of T-Rex, rather than as remnants of an older branch. The idea was radical because it suggested parallel evolution. In the northern hemisphere, Coelurosaurs like tyrannosaurs had taken one route, shrinking their arms and enlarging their skulls. In the south, if Megaraptors were indeed Coelurosaurs, they had taken another route, investing in arms and claws rather than jaws. The debates grew sharper as each new fossil was uncovered. A fragmentary skull here, a vertebra there, each added clues but rarely enough to settle the matter. Analyses using cladistics, the method of comparing shared traits across species, produced trees that often contradicted one another depending on which characters were emphasized. In some trees, Megaraptors emerged as Carcharodontosaurian Allosauroids, cousins of giants like Giganotosaurus. In others, they slid over into Coelurosauria, clustering near Tyrannosauroids. The instability of their placement reflected the incomplete nature of the evidence, but also how convergent evolution can blur lines. Different lineages can evolve similar traits when adapting to similar ecological pressures, making them look more related than they really are. One of the most puzzling aspects was the combination of traits. The hand claws suggested one thing, the pneumatization of bones suggested another, the skull fragments yet another. In some respects they resembled allosaurs. In others, they aligned more with tyrannosaur-like Coelurosaurs. For paleontologists, this was a reminder that evolutionary history is not neat. It is messy, tangled, and full of convergences and reversals. The Megaraptors sat at a crossroads of features, like evolutionary tricksters refusing to declare their true allegiance. The confusion also reveals something about the limits of the fossil record. Imagine trying to reconstruct the identity of a modern animal if all you had was a claw and part of a rib. A cat and a wolverine, for example, might appear deceptively similar under such conditions. Now add tens of millions of years of erosion and distortion, and the difficulty multiplies. Megaraptors were victims of this fragmentary preservation. For years, the lack of overlapping skeletal parts across specimens meant comparisons were tenuous. You might have a femur from one species, a claw from another, a skull fragment from yet another, with no guarantee they lined up cleanly. By the 2010s, the weight of evidence began to lean toward the Coelurosaurian interpretation. Detailed analyses suggested Megaraptors were early branching tyrannosauroids, relatives rather than descendants of the famous T-Rex. This meant that their differences from the northern tyrants were not mistakes of classification, but the result of divergent evolutionary paths taken after a common ancestor. The tyrannosaurs of the north emphasized skull power. The Megaraptors of the south emphasized arm and claw power, two sides of the same coin, shaped by geography and ecological circumstance. But even today, not all paleontologists agree. Some still see them as closer to allosauroids, and the debate continues in journals and conferences. The discovery of Joaquinraptor casali in the 20s added fresh fuel to this debate. Its well-preserved skeleton offered new data, allowing researchers to compare elements long missing from the record. The consensus for now tilts toward Megaraptors being tyrannosauroid relatives, but the scars of the debate remain. Scientists are cautious. They know how many times interpretations have swung in the past. They know how many surprises fragmentary fossils can hold. For the broader story of dinosaur evolution, this confusion is not a failure. It is a reminder that our reconstructions are provisional, always subject to revision as new evidence comes to light. Paleontology is not about definitive answers carved in stone. It is about piecing together a mosaic from shards, aware that the picture will change as more shards are found. Megaraptors exemplify this process. They forced scientists to question assumptions, to revisit methods, and to accept uncertainty. They are not just predators of the past. They are provocateurs of the present, challenging how we do science. And so we circle back to the question, why do paleontologists still argue about what Megaraptors were? Because the evidence is incomplete. Because evolution can mimic itself. Because each new bone can shift an entire narrative. And because, in truth, science is not a collection of answers, but a process of narrowing uncertainties. We may never fully settle the question of whether Megaraptors were closer to Allosaurs or Tyrannosaurs, but perhaps the more important insight is that they show us evolution is not linear, not uniform, not predictable. It branches, loops, and experiments. Patagonia's predators are just one of those experiments. In the windswept plateaus of central Patagonia, where the Andes fade into rolling plains and the soil bakes under a dry seasonal sun, paleontologists set their camps in landscapes that are at once barren and full of ghosts. To the untrained eye, 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 in Chubut province looks like a desert scrubland. A few thorny bushes cling to life in gravelly soil. The lakes nearby, like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒, lie shallow and muddy, reminders of a wetter past. Yet beneath these dusty sediments lie the remains of creatures that once ruled the end of the Cretaceous, and among them, one skeleton would become the centerpiece of a debate about the last predators before the asteroid fell. Its name would eventually be Joaquinraptor casali. The discovery did not begin with a single dramatic reveal, as the popular imagination likes to picture. No scientist brushed away a layer of sand to find a perfect skeleton lying in state. Fossil hunting in Patagonia is a slow game of patience and chance. Teams walk transects across outcrops, their eyes scanning for fragments of bone weathering out of the matrix. In the case of Joaquinraptor, scattered pieces of bone first drew attention. Vertebrae and ribs, pale against the reddish earth, hinted that something larger was waiting below. Careful excavation revealed that these were not just the remnants of some common herbivore. They belonged to a predator, and not just any predator, but one from a group known for its oversized claws and puzzling anatomy. The locality, later dubbed Valle Joaquin, lies in the upper part of the Lago 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 formation. This formation is a layer cake of sediments deposited during the late Cretaceous, and the bones of Joaquinraptor were found close to its very top. That makes them not only some of the best preserved remains of Megaraptors, but also some of the youngest in the world. Each metre of sediment here is a page in a book, and Joaquinraptor comes from the final paragraphs of the story, before the asteroid struck 66 million years ago. For paleontologists, this is gold. Not only do you have a rare predator fossil, but you also know it lived at the very end of the age of dinosaurs. The excavation was painstaking. The skeleton was not laid out in an articulated pose. It was partly scattered, partly preserved in place, and partly distorted by millions of years of geological compression. Yet enough remained to reconstruct a surprising amount of the animal. A partial skull with maxilla, quadrate, and dentaries. Postcranial elements like vertebrae, ribs, and a hemal arch. Powerful forelimb bones, including the humerus and ulna, along with the telltale manual claw of digit 2. Portions of the pelvis and hind limb, including the femur and tibia, even parts of the foot. For Megaraptors, this is an unusually complete haul. Many named species rest on far less. But what set this specimen apart was not only its completeness. Between the jaws, paleontologists noticed something odd. Wedged between the dentaries of the skull was another bone, not belonging to the predator. It was the humerus of a crocodiliform. The association was so close, with teeth pressing against the bone, that it raised immediate questions. Was this the predator's last meal? Or was it a coincidence, a quirk of fossilization where two carcasses happened to overlap? Taphonomy, The study of how organisms decay and fossilize often throws up surprises like this. Water can move bones, sediment can collapse, scavengers can jumble remains. But the intimate placement of the crocodilian bone inside the mouth of Joaquinraptor was striking enough to suggest it may have been swallowed, or at least carried there. If so, it is a rare glimpse of behaviour locked in stone. The setting of the excavation added to the story. Patagonia's geology is challenging, with wind carving through exposed sediments and sudden weather shifts turning digs into endurance tests. Teams camp for weeks, often far from towns, relying on generators, water tanks and long supply runs. In this case, the discovery was attributed to a joint Argentine team, led by researchers who had spent decades combing the Chubut province for fossils. Their patience was rewarded with one of the most significant megaraptorid specimens yet uncovered. It was formally described in the mid-2020s and named Joaquinraptor casali, in tribute both to the son of the lead author and to Dr. Gabriel Andres Casal, a colleague who had contributed greatly to the study of Cretaceous Patagonia. Naming a new dinosaur is never taken lightly. It is not just a label, but a recognition that the skeleton shows enough unique traits to stand apart from known genera. In this case, features of the skull roof, the shape of the parietals, the structure of the ulna, and the proportions of the femur and claws all marked it as distinct. The fact that it came from such a late horizon in the Cretaceous added further weight, making it not just another Megaraptor, but perhaps the youngest known member of the group. It bridged a gap in the fossil record and confirmed that Megaraptors were alive until the very end. What makes the story compelling is not just the dry anatomy. It is the human side of the excavation. Imagine the team members crouched under the Patagonia sun, chisels in hand, brushing sediment away grain by grain. The thrill of realizing the claw you just uncovered matches the oversized digits of a predator, long suspected but rarely confirmed. The quiet evenings back at camp, cataloguing fragments, wondering if the skeleton will yield enough to tell its story. And then the moment when you realize the jaws cradle a crocodilian bone, opening the door to speculation about feeding behaviour. For paleontologists, these moments are not just scientific finds, they're experiences of connection with creatures long dead, moments where the barrier of time feels thinner. The importance of Joaquinraptor lies partly in what it represents. For decades, Megaraptors were shadows built from fragments. Here, at last, was a specimen with enough parts preserved to flesh out its anatomy. Here was evidence that the group did not disappear before the final crisis, but survived right up until the asteroid. And here was a snapshot, however tentative, of what it may have eaten. Each of these elements transforms how we understand the role of Megaraptors in Cretaceous Patagonia. Of course, questions remain. Was the crocodilian humerus really a last meal, or just a coincidence of fossilization? Did Joaquinraptor die in the act of feeding? Or was it buried together with its prey by chance? Was it fully grown, or still on its way to a larger size? Histological analysis of its bones suggests it was at least sexually mature, perhaps around 19 years old, but not yet at full somatic maturity. This means the individual was old enough to reproduce but might have still been growing when it died. That alone paints a vivid picture of its life history. The 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿 site itself is also now a reference point. Geological studies of its sediments show it was laid down during a warm climate with seasonal rainfall. Pollen fossils suggest a mix of vegetation that could support diverse herbivores and thus the predators that hunted them. The association of crocodilian remains hints at nearby waterways, perhaps shallow rivers or lakes where carcasses could accumulate. To hold a Megaraptor in such a context is to place it firmly in its ecological setting, rather than as an isolated museum specimen. Finding Joaquinraptor was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of years of preparation, cleaning, and study. Each bone was stabilized, measured, and compared with other Megaraptorid specimens. Papers were written, phylogenetic analyses run, debates rekindled. Yet it all traces back to those days in the field, when an outline of ribs and vertebrae first caught someone's eye on a dusty Patagonian hillside. That moment of chance encounter between human eyes and ancient bone began the chain that led to a new name, a new data point, and a new perspective on the final years of the dinosaurs. So how does one even find a Megaraptor with crocodile bones in its mouth? The answer is simple but unsatisfying. You walk, you look, you dig, and sometimes, if luck and persistence align, the past offers you a story preserved in stone. For Joaquinraptor, that story begins in Patagonia's Valle Joaquin and ends 66 million years ago in the shadow of an asteroid. Between those 2 points, all we can do is piece together the fragments and tell them as carefully as we can. In September of the year 2025, a new name appeared in the pages of Nature Communications. It was not just another taxonomic label to be tucked away in the catalogue of prehistoric life. It was a name that carried the weight of discovery, the weight of place, and the weight of human lives entwined with science: Joaquinraptor casali. To the casual reader, this might sound like any other dinosaur name, a string of syllables with the familiar raptor ending attached. But to those who know how names are chosen, it speaks volumes. It reveals not only what kind of creature this was, but also who found it, who studied it, and how deeply human stories always accompany the bones we pull from the earth. The tradition of naming new species is one of the oldest rituals in science. It traces back to the 18th century, when Carl Linnaeus began formalizing the rules of classification. Under the system of binomial nomenclature, every new species receives a 2-part Latinized name, the genus and the specific epithet. The genus links it to broader kin. The epithet often honours something unique about the specimen. Over centuries, these names have commemorated places, features, personalities, even jokes. They are at once rigorous and personal, following the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, but also reflecting the quirks of those who coined them. In the case of Joaquinraptor casali, the first part of the name pays tribute to Joaquin, the son of the lead author Lucio Ibiricu. It is rare, but not unheard of, for dinosaurs to carry the names of children. Sometimes it is a gesture of gratitude for the patience families show as researchers spend months in the field. Sometimes it is a way of tying personal legacy to scientific legacy. Here, Joaquin's name is tied forever to the place where the bones were found, Valle Joaquin. In this way, the etymology folds family, geography and paleontology together into one word. For the scientists who braved the Patagonian winds, the name was not an abstract exercise. It was a way of embedding the fossil into human memory. The second half of the genus, raptor, has a complicated history. In Latin it means thief or seizer, a nod to predatory habits. The term entered the dinosaur lexicon with Velociraptor in the early 20th century, and since then it has been attached to numerous carnivorous dinosaurs. It carries with it connotations of speed, agility, and danger. In the public imagination, fueled by film and literature, raptor has become almost synonymous with dinosaur predator, but scientists use it more carefully. In Joaquinraptor, the suffix emphasizes the creature's identity as a grasping hunter, armed with claws that could seize prey. It does not mean it was closely related to dromaeosaurs like Velociraptor, but rather that its predatory style inspired a name echoing that lineage. Here, raptor is less about family ties and more about an image, a thief of life, stalking the plains of late Cretaceous Patagonia. The species name, casali, honours Dr. Gabriel Andres Casal, an Argentine paleontologist whose work on Cretaceous Patagonia shaped much of what we know about its geology and fossils. Dr. Casal was instrumental in formally recognising and naming the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 Formation, the very rocks that yielded Joaquinraptor. By attaching his name to the species, the authors acknowledged the intellectual scaffolding on which their discovery rested. Fossil science is never the achievement of a single excavation. It is built layer upon layer, each generation of researchers mapping formations, identifying sites, developing methods. To name a dinosaur after Casal is to recognise that without his groundwork, Joaquinraptor might have remained anonymous. Together then, the name Joaquinraptor casali condenses multiple histories: the family history of a researcher and his son, the professional history of a geologist who shaped the field, the deep-time history of a predator that lived 66 million years ago, and the linguistic history of the word raptor, stretching from ancient Latin thieves to modern cinematic hunters. In one name, all these threads converge. But why does naming matter so much? Why not simply call the fossil specimen 1112 from Chubut province and leave it at that? Because names are anchors. They give identity, and with identity comes memory. A numbered specimen might languish in drawers known only to specialists. A named dinosaur enters discourse, enters textbooks, enters the public imagination. Names make fossils speak. They carry them beyond technical reports into the broader cultural consciousness. Joaquinraptor is not just a code in a database, it is a character in Earth's story. There is also the emotional weight. Paleontologists spend years of their lives in harsh conditions to recover bones that often yield little glory. Naming is one of the few moments when they can acknowledge the personal cost and the community effort. To name a fossil after a colleague is to say, you mattered, your work mattered, and now your name will endure alongside the bones we study. To name it after a son is to say, this discovery is not just mine, it is ours, part of a family sacrifice. Naming is an act of gratitude, of remembrance, of permanence. The raptor in the name, though, deserves reflection too. It raises questions about how language shapes perception. When the public hears raptor, they think of sickle-clawed pack hunters from popular culture. Joaquinraptor was nothing of the kind. Its claws were on the hands, not the feet. Its lineage was different. By choosing the word, scientists both leaned into and gently subverted expectation. They invited people in with a familiar hook, but then challenged them to learn the distinctions. This is part of science communication woven into taxonomy itself. A name must satisfy the code, but it also speaks to readers, students, and enthusiasts. Joaquinraptor succeeds because it is both accurate enough for professionals and evocative enough for the public. Still, naming is not without controversy. Some argue that dedicating names to people, especially family members, risks blurring personal sentiment with scientific objectivity. Others counter that science has always been a human enterprise, and to pretend otherwise is to erase the very real sacrifices behind the work. With Joaquinraptor, the balance seems fair. 1 part family, 1 part colleague, 1 part predatory imagery. It acknowledges the human dimension without compromising the descriptive essence. In the end, the act of naming Joaquinraptor casali reminds us that paleontology is not just about bones, it is about stories. Stories of creatures long gone, stories of people who uncover them, stories of how language bridges those two worlds. To speak the name is to remember both the dinosaur and the humans who brought it back to light. And perhaps that is the deeper meaning of naming. It resists forgetting. Fossils already endure millions of years in stone. A name ensures they endure in our minds. So why name it after Joaquin and Dr. Casal? And what does raptor really mean? Because science is human. Because fossils without names fade into silence. Because in honouring family, colleagues and predation itself, the name tells us not just what this dinosaur was, but who we are as scientists, as parents, as inheritors of stories. The thief of Patagonia is not only a relic of evolution, it is a reminder that discovery is always, unavoidably personal. When paleontologists announced the discovery of Joaquinraptor casali, one of the first things that struck the community was how much of the animal had actually been found. For decades, Megaraptors had been creatures assembled from fragments, shadows glimpsed through isolated bones, a claw here, a rib there, maybe part of a vertebra, enough to know that something large and clawed stalked the Cretaceous of the southern continents, but not enough to draw a confident portrait. That is why the specimen catalogued as UNPSJB-PV1112 matters so much. Though it is still partial, it is partial in a way that finally allows paleontologists to build comparisons, test hypotheses, and reconstruct what a Megaraptor truly looked like at the very end of the dinosaur age. The skeleton was not found in pristine articulation. Time and burial had scattered and shifted the bones. But what emerged from the sediments of the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒 formation was a treasure of overlapping parts, the kind of preservation that paleontologists often dream of but rarely encounter with Megaraptors. There was a partial skull, with the right maxilla preserved alongside fragments of the skull roof and brain case. Both dentries were recovered, still holding teeth, giving us a sense of how the jaws looked in life. There were vertebrae from the tail, ribs from the torso, a hemal arch, and pieces of the shoulder girdle. There were forelimb bones, humerus, ulna, radius, preserved well enough to measure and compare. There was the unmistakable claw of a manual digit 2, the curved blade that defines the group. The hind limbs were represented too, with a femur, parts of the tibia, and pedal phalanges including another claw. All told, it was a surprisingly broad sample of the skeleton. The skull pieces alone are worth reflection. For a long time, Megaraptorid skulls were poorly understood. Most reconstructions relied heavily on comparisons with distant relatives. The right maxilla of Joaquinraptor shows the elongate, lightly built architecture that has become characteristic of the clade. It had a sub-triangular shape, with fenestrae and shelves that hinted extensive pneumatization, the hollowing out of bones by air sacs. The dentaries confirm the impression of a narrow, elongated jaw with 17 alveoli for teeth. Those teeth in turn were thin and blade-like, with serrations absent on the mesial edges. These details reinforce the idea that Megaraptors were not bone-crushing predators like Tyrannosaurus rex, but slicing hunters whose teeth were designed to cut flesh rather than smash through it. The skull roof and brain case fragments reveal proportions unusual among theropods. The parietals are narrow and transversely compressed, creating a more constricted profile than in many other meat-eating dinosaurs. This has been noted as a feature converging toward tyrannosauroids, suggesting that despite their long arm differences, the southern predators shared some cranial architecture with their northern cousins. The presence of a well-marked supratemporal fossa with a sigmoid anterior margin adds further unique traits that separate Joaquinraptor from other known megaraptors. Even with these incomplete cranial remains, paleontologists can sketch the outline of a predator that was long-headed, sharp-toothed, and lightweight in construction. A hunter adapted for slashing rather than bludgeoning. Moving down the body, the vertebrae are particularly striking. 3 caudal vertebrae from the tail were recovered, and their centra are marked by deep elliptical fossae that cover more than half of the lateral surfaces. This degree of excavation is unique, reinforcing how pneumatic these animals were. Their skeletons were riddled with air sacs, a feature that lightened the body and may have been linked to a highly active metabolism, closer to birds than to reptiles in physiology. The dorsal ribs, too, were pneumatized, resembling those of other megaraptors, but more gracile than in some close relatives. Combined, these bones suggest a body plan that emphasized lightness and efficiency. Despite reaching lengths of 7 meters or more, these predators were not heavy-footed brutes. They were built with air and speed in mind. The shoulder and arm bones are among the most informative. The scapular coracoid shows the fused shoulder elements, with distinctive ridges and processes that differ from related species. The humerus is remarkably robust, even more massive than in most other megaraptors, with a subrectangular delta-pectoral crest. The ulna is especially diagnostic, with an elongate olecranon process and nearly straight shaft, ending in a medially expanded distal end. These traits combine to create a forelimb that was not only long but also powerfully muscled. The radius, with its crescent-shaped distal end, adds further distinction. These features together underline what made megaraptors unique among large theropods. The arms were not shrinking relics, but prime weapons. In life, the muscles attaching to these bones would have powered claws that could grasp, slash, and hold struggling prey. That claw, the manual ungual of digit 2, is one of the most iconic bones of the skeleton. Curved and formidable, it embodies the essence of megaraptorid predation. Unlike the foot claws of dromaeosaurs, this claw was on the hand, meaning that the animal could strike with its arms in ways most other large predators could not. Its curvature and thickness place Joaquinraptor closer to other Patagonian forms than to Australian relatives like Australovenator. It was slightly shorter and thicker than some, perhaps reflecting functional adaptations unique to this lineage. Whatever the precise mechanics, in life this claw was a lethal instrument, honed over millions of years of evolutionary experimentation. The hind limb elements add further depth. The femur is robust, more so than in earlier megaraptors, and lacks some of the trochanteric features found in other species. It shows a projected fourth trochanter, anchoring strong muscles, and a shaft that bows laterally rather than remaining straight. The tibia, though broken into pieces, preserves enough detail to reveal a tall facet for the astragalus, a feature associated with Coelurosaurian affinitors. The pedal phalanges include a non-ungual bone with a deep extensor fossa, and a pedal claw resembling those of other megaraptorids. Even the feet then suggest a predator with balance and agility, not simply mass. Taken together, this partial skeleton paints a body that was more complete than nearly any other megaraptor known before. Where earlier discoveries gave us glimpses, Joaquinraptor gives us a nearly full sketch. From head to tail, from jaws to claws, it is a predator that can now be reconstructed with confidence. And with that reconstruction comes insight. This was not a lumbering beast. It was a lightweight but muscular hunter, armed with sharp teeth and powerful arms, adapted to dominate its ecosystem at the close of the Cretaceous. The value of such a specimen cannot be overstated. In paleontology, completeness is rare, and for groups like Megaraptors it is precious. Each overlapping bone allows comparisons that were impossible before. Each distinctive trait helps refine the family tree. Each fragment adds another line to the biography of a lineage that has long resisted clarity. In the case of Joaquinraptor casali, the body in pieces is finally enough to tell a coherent story. And yet humility is necessary. The skeleton, while unusually complete, is still partial. Much remains unknown. The skull is incomplete, the pelvis largely absent, the full tail and arms still missing. Reconstructions must still lean on inference and comparison. As with all fossils, what we have is both a gift and a limit. But compared to the decades of confusion that preceded it, this is a leap forward. So what does a partial skeleton reveal when it is more complete than almost anything else we have had? It reveals enough to finally see the contours of a predator that lived and died at the threshold of extinction. It reveals a creature whose arms, teeth and bones remind us that evolution experimented until the very end. And it reminds us that sometimes, in paleontology, a body in pieces is enough to rewrite an entire story. When the first fragments of Megaraptors began to surface in the late 20th century, it was not the teeth or the skulls that captured imagination, but the claws. Enormous, recurved, scythe-like hand claws that dwarfed those of most other theropods. They looked like weapons pulled from a myth, grotesquely oversized compared to the rest of the arm. They were so striking, in fact, that for years paleontologists even mistook them for foot claws, assuming they belonged to a giant cousin of Velociraptor. Only later did it become clear that these talons belonged to the hands, not the feet, and that this group of predators had taken an entirely different evolutionary path. The unguals of Megaraptors are extraordinary not only in size but also in their persistence across the lineage. From earlier forms like Megaraptor 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 of Argentina, described in the 1990s, through Australovenator in Australia, and later forms in Patagonia like Megaraptor and finally Joaquinraptor, the hypertrophy of manual digit 2 remained a constant theme. Evolution kept exaggerating it, generation after generation. In most theropods, the arms tended to reduce over time, as in Tyrannosaurs, or remained proportionally balanced as in Allosaurs. In Megaraptors, the opposite occurred. The arms became not only long but muscular, and the claws grew to lengths that could exceed 40 centimeters in some species. The functional interpretation of these claws has been a matter of intense speculation. Their curvature, deep flexor tubercles and robust cross-sections suggest they were not decorative but actively used in hunting. The closest modern analogies might be found in large birds of prey, where talons are used to pierce and hold struggling prey. But unlike eagles or hawks, Megaraptors wielded their talons with their arms, not their feet. This implies a different style of predation, one that might have combined slashing with grasping. Imagine a predator that could strike with both its jaws and its forelimbs simultaneously, each delivering lethal trauma. Biomechanical studies of Australovenator's claws, conducted in the early 2010s, used robotic reconstructions to test motion ranges. These analyses suggested that the claws were capable of significant flexion and extension, and the arm musculature would have given them forceful grip. The shape of the ungles indicates they were not ideal for slicing through hide-like knives, but rather for hooking and holding. Once embedded, they would have been difficult to dislodge, providing a powerful anchor against which the jaws could work. In this sense, the claws were perhaps more like grappling hooks than sabres. Another line of evidence comes from the attachment surfaces on the forelimb bones. The deltapectoral crest of the humerus in Joaquinraptor is remarkably developed, suggesting huge muscles anchored there. The olecranon process of the ulna is elongated, providing leverage for powerful extension. Together, these features point to a forelimb designed not for delicate manipulation, but for bursts of strength. If the claws were the blades, the arms were the engines that drove them. In contrast to the shrinking vestigial forelimbs of tyrannosaurs, Megaraptors doubled down on their arms, making them the centerpiece of their hunting toolkit. It is worth pausing to ask why evolution took this path. What ecological conditions favoured such hypertrophy of the claws? One possibility lies in the prey landscape of southern continents during the Cretaceous. Patagonia, for instance, was home to titanosaurs, some of the largest herbivores ever to walk the earth, as well as armoured notosuchians, agile ornithopods, and a variety of mid-sized reptiles. To subdue such prey, sheer bite force might not have been enough. A predator that could latch onto flesh and hold with both arms and teeth might have had a critical advantage. The claws could act as grappling tools, stabilising prey while the jaws delivered multiple cuts. Comparisons with other theropods make the uniqueness of Megaraptor claws stand out even more. In Allosaurids, the hand claws were modest, functional but not exaggerated. In Carcharodontosaurids, the jaws were the primary weapons, with arms playing a secondary role. In Tyrannosaurids, the jaws became massive engines of destruction, while the arms atrophied. Megaraptors went in the opposite direction, retaining long muscular arms and turning their claws into iconic features. In this sense, they represent an alternative evolutionary experiment in how to build an apex predator. There is also the question of how these claws grew over an individual's lifetime. Histological sections from related species suggest that growth continued well into maturity. A juvenile Megaraptor might have had proportionally smaller claws, with hypertrophy intensifying as the animal reached adulthood. This means that claw size could also have been a visual signal, a way of displaying maturity, strength, or dominance. Predation and communication are rarely exclusive in evolution. A structure that is useful for one can easily serve the other. Still, caution is warranted. We cannot watch a Megaraptor hunt. We cannot see precisely how it swung its arms, or how prey responded. The claws give us evidence of capacity, not certainty. They tell us what was possible, not what was inevitable. This is where paleontology forces humility. Even with claws that look like they belong in a myth, we can only infer behaviour through comparison, experiment and context. What we do know is that these claws were not vestigial. They were central. They were the tools that defined the lineage. The persistence of this trait across continents is telling. From South America to Australia, Megaraptors consistently carried oversized claws. This suggests that the adaptation was not local but fundamental, a core strategy for survival across varied ecosystems. Such convergence reinforces the idea that the claws were essential, not optional. They were the reason Megaraptors thrived for tens of millions of years, right up until the last days of the Cretaceous. In life, the sight of such a predator must have been terrifying. A 7-metre animal advancing not only with teeth, but with slashing hands tipped by blades. We often think of claws as secondary weapons, like the nails of a cat compared to its jaws. In Megaraptors, the equation was reversed. The claws may have been the primary means of securing prey, the jaws following through once the arms had done their work. This inversion is part of what makes the group so fascinating, and so unlike the tyrants of the Northern Hemisphere. So why did evolution keep exaggerating those claws, and how did they hunt with them? Because in the shifting landscapes of Gondwana it worked. Because prey was large, defences were tough, and survival demanded innovation. The claws of Megaraptors were more than bones. They were strategies written in keratin and muscle, weapons that allowed these predators to dominate ecosystems until the very end. And even though we cannot know every detail, the evidence is enough to remind us that evolution is not a straight path. It is a web of experiments, and sometimes the strangest ones last the longest. One of the strangest things about Joaquinraptor casali is that when you lay its skeleton out and begin comparing it to other theropods, the animal seems to be wearing two evolutionary masks at once. Look at its skull, and you find echoes of tyrannosauroids, those northern giants that rose to dominance in the late Cretaceous. Look at its arms and claws, and you're reminded of the long-limbed Allosaurs, predators of an earlier age. It is as if this Patagonian predator was an evolutionary collage, a creature shaped by pressures that pulled it in two very different directions, and yet, it worked. The cranial elements of Joaquinraptor tell the first half of this story. The maxilla and dentary fragments show a lightly built skull, riddled with pneumatic cavities, much like those of tyrannosauroids. Pneumatization, the invasion of air sacs into bone, is not just a quirk of anatomy. It signals an animal that was lightened structurally, an adaptation that reduces weight and may also relate to a high metabolic rate. The deep elliptical fossae along the caudal vertebrae echo this same theme. Air everywhere, bones reduced to lattices rather than solid blocks. Tyrannosaurs of the north, like Albertosaurus or Tyrannosaurus, show similar patterns of pneumatic invasion. In this way, Joaquinraptor looks more like a northern tyrant than a southern holdover. Its teeth reinforce the impression. Slender, blade-like and serrated only along the back edges, they differ from the thick, bone-crunching dentition of tyrannosaurids. But the dental battery shows a similar specialization for slicing flesh rather than gripping. The arrangement of alveoli in the dentary suggests a long, narrow jaw packed with closely spaced teeth. Combined with the pneumatic maxilla, this produced a skull that was not robust like a tyrannosaur's, but nevertheless carried design cues reminiscent of them. A predator optimized for cutting meat, not for wrestling prey through brute force. The skull roof and brain case add subtler similarities. The parietals are transversely compressed, creating a narrow roof with supratemporal fossa that resembles the tyrannosauroid condition more than that of earlier allosauroids. This detail has sparked endless debate about affinities, because such features can signal shared ancestry or simply convergent solutions to similar ecological challenges. Either way, it ties Joaquinraptor visually and anatomically to the predators of the north, making it look like a misplaced cousin, or at least a mimic of their success. But shift your attention from the head to the arms, and the story changes entirely. The humerus of Joaquinraptor is massive, with a broad subrectangular deltapectoral crest that could anchor powerful shoulder and arm muscles. The ulna is equally revealing, long, nearly straight, with an elongated olecranon process that suggests great leverage for extension. Its distal end is expanded medially, giving the forearm an unusual breadth. These are not the reduced limbs of tyrannosaurs, which had abandoned their arms as functional tools. They are instead the hypertrophied muscular arms of a predator that still relied on them heavily. In this sense, Joaquinraptor is much closer to Allosaurs, those Jurassic hunters with long, slashing arms. The manual ungulls, particularly that of digit 2, complete the picture. Thick, curved and deadly, they are far more elaborate than anything in tyrannosaurs. They recall the hooked claws of Allosaurus or Nuovenator, only taken further. The function seems clear, grasping, hooking and holding prey, perhaps in coordination with the slicing teeth. This combination, arms like grappling hooks, jaws like flesh shears, is not seen in the tyrannosaur lineage, which shifted the burden of predation entirely to the skull. Instead, it is a throwback, but a throwback refined for a very different world. Comparative anatomy underscores this duality. The ulna of Joaquinraptor shares diagnostic features with earlier Megaraptors and shows derived traits that separate it from Carcharodontosaurids. Yet its mechanical profile looks more like that of an allosaurid forelimb than like anything from Coelurosaurs. The femur, by contrast, displays trochanteric features converging toward tyrannosauroids. The tail vertebrae, riddled with pneumatic fossae, also lean toward a tyrant-like condition. It is a mosaic, each region of the skeleton whispering a different evolutionary affiliation. What does this mean? One interpretation is that Megaraptors like Joaquinraptor are genuinely closer to tyrannosauroids, a southern offshoot that retained arms when their northern kin lost them. Another is that we are witnessing convergence. In the late Cretaceous, across both hemispheres, large predators were evolving similar cranial lightening and pneumatic adaptations, even as their strategies for handling prey diverged. Either way, the anatomy forces us to abandon simplistic categories. Joaquinraptor is not neatly an allosaur or a tyrannosaur relative. It is something stranger, a hybrid of traits that reflect millions of years of independent evolution in isolation. There is a metaphor here, though it must be stated carefully. Evolution is not linear, nor is it bound by our categories. In the northern hemisphere, tyrannosaurids took over, shrinking their arms and enlarging their jaws. In the southern hemisphere, Megaraptors doubled down on their arms while developing skulls that looked tyrant-like. Both paths worked. Both produced apex predators that survived until the asteroid. The resemblance of Joaquinraptor's skull to Tyrants and its arms to Allosaurs is not a contradiction. It is a testament to the diversity of evolutionary solutions. From a practical perspective, these contrasts also explain why classifying Megaraptors has been so contentious. Every time researchers focused on one region of the skeleton, they were pulled in a different taxonomic direction. Look at the skull, and you think Tyrannosauroid. Look at the arms, and you think Allosauroid. Look at the vertebrae, and you see something else again. It is no wonder the debate has persisted for decades. But in Joaquinraptor, this mosaic is not a frustration. It is a revelation. It shows that these animals were evolutionary experiments in blending strategies, not neat representatives of one lineage. So why does Joaquinraptor look half Tyrannosaur and half Allosaur? Because life does not follow our categories. Because isolated continents fostered predators that borrowed traits from both lineages or converged upon them independently. Because evolution is opportunistic, not tidy. The skull and arms of Joaquinraptor remind us that the world before the asteroid was filled not with caricatures of tyrants or relics of the Jurassic, but with predators whose anatomy told complex hybrid stories. How do we know how old a dinosaur was when it died? It is not as though bones come with a date stamp or a written record of birthdays, and yet buried within the microscopic structure of fossilized bone there are faint echoes of a calendar, patterns etched year by year into the fabric of the skeleton. For Joaquinraptor casali, those patterns tell us something remarkable. This individual was at least 19 years old when it took its final step into the mud of late Maastrichtian Patagonia. It had lived long enough to reach sexual maturity, and yet, according to the evidence in its bones, it may not have fully stopped growing. The technique is called osteohistology, the study of the microscopic structure of bone tissue. When paleontologists cut a cross-section through a long bone, like a tibia, and polish it thin enough for light to pass through, they reveal an inner world of fibres, canals and rings. These rings, called lines of arrested growth, or LAGs, are not so different from the growth rings of trees. They form when an animal's growth slows or pauses, usually during seasonal stresses such as winter scarcity or drought. Count them, and you can estimate how many years the animal lived. Measure the spacing between them, and you can infer how growth rates changed over the course of a lifetime. In Joaquinraptor, the tibia offered the clearest record. Under magnification, paleontologists counted at least 19 distinct growth marks. Early in the bone's history, the spaces between marks are broad, signalling rapid growth in the juvenile and subadult years. Later, the spacing narrows dramatically, a sign that growth was slowing as the animal approached adulthood. This change is a key signal not just of age, but of maturity. A sharp reduction in growth rate is often linked to the onset of sexual maturity, the point when the body diverts more energy to reproduction than to size. And yet, one important feature was missing. Many dinosaurs, like mammals today, eventually reach a phase of somatic maturity where growth essentially stops. In bone, this plateau leaves a signature called an external fundamental system, or EFS, a layer of tightly packed lamellar bone right beneath the outer surface. In Joaquinraptor, there was no EFS. The lines of arrested growth were present, but they did not culminate in that final ceiling. This tells us the animal had not yet reached its maximum adult size. It had lived long enough to reproduce, but it was still adding millimeters to its bones each year, still becoming. The dorsal rib provided a second window into age, though a less reliable one. Like the tibia, it carried rings of arrested growth, but the record was fuzzier. Pneumatic cavities, internal spaces formed by air sacs invading the bone, had hollowed much of the rib, erasing parts of the growth history. Secondary remodeling, where old bone is resorbed and replaced by new tissue, further blurred the timeline. 13 growth marks could be seen, fewer than in the tibia, but paleontologists understand that ribs are less dependable record keepers. The tibia, dense and relatively stable, remains the gold standard for tracking years. What emerges is a portrait of a predator that lived nearly 2 decades. That alone is noteworthy. In the world of theropods, lifespans varied widely. Smaller species often lived faster, dying within a decade. giant tyrannosaurs could live into their 20s, with Sue the famous Tyrannosaurus from South Dakota estimated at about 28 years at death. Joaquinraptor, reaching 19 years without full somatic maturity, falls somewhere in between. It was robust and large, but not yet the maximum size it could have achieved had it lived longer. These histological insights also allow scientists to probe deeper questions of life history. Was Joaquinraptor a fast-growing, short-lived predator, or a slow-growing, long-lived one? The evidence leans toward the first. Its early growth marks suggest rapid juvenile expansion, much like other megaraptors and large theropods. That fits with a strategy where young individuals grew quickly out of the vulnerable phase, reaching a size where predation risk dropped. Later, growth slowed, conserving resources and channeling energy into reproduction. This trajectory mirrors that of many predatory dinosaurs, but the exact balance between speed and longevity remains difficult to pin down. Another subtlety lies in the distinction between sexual and somatic maturity. In non-avian dinosaurs, it is thought that reproduction began before bodies fully plateaued. Growth marks in Joaquinraptor bear this out. The reduced spacing suggests sexual maturity had arrived, yet the absence of an EFS shows the skeleton had not finished growing. This staggered timeline may have been widespread among theropods. It implies a world where predators could begin breeding while still physically expanding, an adaptation that ensured population survival even in harsh environments. It is important, though, to recognize limits. Histology is an interpretive science. Growth rings can be miscounted, destroyed by erosion, or confused with secondary remodeling. Not every pause in growth necessarily equals a year. Seasonal cycles can vary, and stress events can create additional marks. For Joaquinraptor, 19 is a minimum age, not an absolute. It may have lived longer, with earlier rings lost to remodeling near the bone's medullary cavity. This caveat is essential. The fossil record gives us glimpses, not certainties. Beyond age, the histology of Joaquinraptor illuminates its biology in subtler ways. The presence of vascular canals in woven fibred bone tissue points to rapid growth, a hallmark of high metabolic rates. The mix of fibrolamellar and parallel fibred bone suggests a balance between speed and strength in the skeleton. And the presence of Sharpie's fibres, tiny anchoring fibres that attach bone to muscles or ligaments, shows how dynamic and stressed these bones were in life. Even at the microscopic scale, Joaquinraptor was a living, working predator, not just a static fossil. The picture that emerges is not just of an individual's age, but of its stage in life. 19 years old, sexually mature, still growing, still investing energy in a body that had not quite reached its peak. This is not a juvenile. It is not yet a senescent elder. It is something in between, a prime predator cut short before it could see its maximum potential. And because it died close to the very end of the Cretaceous, that unrealized potential will forever remain locked in speculation. Perhaps that is the most human part of this story. We measure time by birthdays and anniversaries. Dinosaurs measured time in rings of bone. For Joaquinraptor, those rings end abruptly in the late Maastrichtian, 19 seasons into its life, with no external fundamental system to close the book. It leaves us with the image of a predator still in motion when the story stopped. Was it killed by disease, by injury, by chance encounter with another predator? We cannot say. All we know is that its bones record 19 years of survival, of growth, of seasons endured, and then silence. And so the question lingers, how many more rings would there have been if the asteroid had never come? When paleontologists brushed away the sandstone around the jaws of Joaquinraptor casali, they found something unexpected lodged between its dentaries, the humerus of a crocodile relative. It is the kind of moment that makes a dig site fall silent, because such associations are rarely random. Dinosaurs are found with sediments, with roots, with pebbles pressed against them, but a single limb bone of another vertebrate cradled neatly inside the mouth is something different. It suggests a story about what this predator was doing in its final moments, or at least what it was eating shortly before it died. But what kind of story is it? Was this the remains of a meal, evidence that megaraptors hunted crocodiles? Or was it something less direct? Scavenging, chance association, or even a fluke of deposition? The most cautious interpretation is that this is simply coincidence. After all, Patagonia at the end of the Cretaceous was a complex floodplain environment, full of rivers, oxbows, and muddy channels where carcasses could be transported and deposited. Crocodilians, or more precisely crocodiliforms, lived in abundance in those waterways. Their remains are not rare in the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐏𝐒 formation. It is not impossible that the humerus was washed into the position by accident, settling between the jaws of the Megaraptor skeleton as both fossilized together. Sedimentary chance is always the simplest explanation. But paleontologists are trained to look at context, not just possibility. The association here was unusually tight. The humerus lay nestled between the dentaries, not scattered near the ribs or drifted in from another layer. The articulation suggests that, if not actually bitten into, the bone was at least in the mouth cavity when burial occurred. That placement makes the feeding interpretation more compelling. So what would it mean if Joaquinraptor was eating crocodiles? Crocodiliforms were formidable in their own right, armoured, with powerful tails and crushing bites. They would not have been easy prey, but that does not mean they were off limits. Large theropods across the world ate crocodiles when opportunity allowed. In North America, tyrannosaurid coprolites have yielded crocodiliform remains. In Africa, abelisaurids and carcharodontosaurids shared ecosystems with giant crocodiles and likely interacted as predator and prey. Megaraptors, with their long hook-clawed arms, may have been uniquely suited to grappling semi-aquatic animals dragged onto shorelines. The powerful manual ungles could have hooked beneath scales or limbs, restraining struggling prey as jaws sliced into softer tissue. The humerus itself offers clues. As a limb bone, it would not have carried much meat compared to a torso or thigh. Finding it in the jaws suggests either that the Megaraptor was consuming the extremities of its prey, gnawing into tougher pieces after more edible parts were gone, or that this was all that remained of a scavenged carcass. The possibility of scavenging cannot be dismissed. Apex predators often scavenge, not as a sign of weakness, but as a matter of efficiency. A crocodile carcass floating downstream would have been an easy meal for a 7-metre theropod. And if only the humerus remained lodged in the jaws when death or burial struck, that would explain the association we see today. There is also the chance that crocodiles were regular prey. In the patchwork of rivers and seasonal rains that characterized late Maastrichtian Patagonia, terrestrial prey may have been sporadic. Herbivorous dinosaurs like titanosaurs were present, but catching them would have required different strategies. A Megaraptor living near water sources may have turned opportunistically to crocodiliforms, just as big cats today sometimes prey on crocodiles in Africa. It would have been dangerous but possible. The claws of Joaquinraptor, so prominent and hypertrophied, seem almost designed for subduing heavily muscled, armour-bearing animals, rather than for quick slices alone. If this was feeding evidence, it also highlights something about how Megaraptors processed food. Unlike tyrannosaurs with bone-crunching teeth, Megaraptors had slender, blade-like teeth that were better at slicing than crushing. They were not designed to splinter bones, but to shear off meat. To access nutrients locked in a crocodile limb, they may have used their claws to tear and reposition, rather than relying on jaw power alone. This synergy between arms and jaws is a consistent theme in Megaraptor biology, and the crocodile bone reinforces it in a very direct way. Skepticism remains warranted. Fossil associations always invite overinterpretation, and paleontology has its history of premature claims about last meals. Sometimes bones found near teeth are red herrings, moved post-mortem. Sometimes an animal died while scavenging and was buried mid-act, leading to misleading associations. And sometimes, yes, things really are coincidence. The scientific stance here is cautious. The crocodile bone might represent prey, scavenging, or simply fortuitous burial. Yet even the cautious stance is telling. It reminds us that predators like Joaquinraptor were not mythic monsters with fixed diets, but real animals in dynamic ecosystems. They ate what was available. They took risks. They scavenged when it made sense. And sometimes they left us traces so tantalizing that we spend years arguing over whether it was evidence of a meal or not. So did Joaquinraptor truly eat crocodiles? Perhaps. The humerus between its teeth is a whisper from 66 million years ago. A whisper that says this predator, on the eve of extinction, was locked in ecological dramas we can only half reconstruct. Maybe it pulled a crocodile from a muddy bank and tore into it with claws and teeth. Maybe it simply scavenged the remains, or maybe the bone was never in its mouth at all, just washed there by chance. What matters is that the fossil keeps us asking. It reminds us that the final days of the Cretaceous were not abstractions but lived realities, full of struggles between predators and prey. And in those realities, even a Megaraptor might have found itself face to face with a crocodile, in life or in death. When most people picture the end of the age of dinosaurs, their minds travel north. They imagine Tyrannosaurus rex pacing the floodplains of North America, towering over herds of horned ceratopsians, ripping into hadrosaurs with its massive skull and bone-crushing teeth. That image has become almost synonymous with the last days of the Cretaceous. But the Earth was a patchwork of continents, each carrying its own cast of predators and prey. While the tyrant lizards ruled the northern hemisphere, the far south told a different story. In the lands we now call Patagonia, the apex role was not filled by T-Rex, but by a lineage of predators stranger and more complicated, the Megaraptors. This difference between north and south is not just geographic, it is evolutionary. When the supercontinent Gondwana fractured, isolation bred unique faunas. South America drifted largely on its own across the late Cretaceous, separated by oceans from Africa and North America. Cut off in this way, its ecosystems developed their own balance of herbivores and carnivores. In Patagonia, this meant immense titanosaurs dominating the plant-eating guilds and megaraptors ascending as the top terrestrial hunters. By the time the asteroid approached, this arrangement was firmly established. The ecological crown worn by megaraptors in Patagonia was not inevitable. Earlier in the Cretaceous, other lineages had tried their hand at apex status. Abelisaurids, short-skulled carnivores with bulldog faces, were widespread across South America. They had strong bites and reduced arms, more reminiscent of bulldozers than grappling hunters. In certain regions they thrived, filling niches similar to those occupied by tyrannosaurs up north. But in central and southern Patagonia, the fossil record suggests Abelisaurids were overshadowed. Here, it was the long-armed, hook-clawed megaraptors that grew large, reaching lengths of 6 to 9 meters and ruling the plains. Why this divergence? Part of the answer may lie in prey structure. Patagonia's herbivore communities leaned heavily on giant sauropods, including saltosaurids and other titanosaurs. These colossal plant-eaters provided enormous biomass, but required specialized strategies to exploit. A predator with slicing teeth and heavily muscled arms could have had an advantage in tackling vulnerable juveniles or injured adults. Abelisaurids, with their reduced forelimbs and short jaws, may have struggled to compete in this environment. Megaraptors, in contrast, were better adapted for versatility, able to grapple, slice, and possibly even coordinate in opportunistic strategies. This made Patagonia's predator kingdom unlike anything in the north. Imagine the symmetry. In the north, T-Rex reigned supreme, small-armed but massively jawed, crushing bones with each bite. In the south, Joaquinraptor and its relatives dominated, not with skulls of that magnitude, but with elongated forelimbs, pneumatic skeletons, and claws that looked like scythes forged for close combat. Two solutions to the same evolutionary challenge, how to kill the largest animals of the late Cretaceous, played out on opposite ends of the globe, never meeting, but each successful in its own realm. The fossil evidence shows this kingdom stretched across central and southern Patagonia in the final millions of years before the asteroid. The 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐓𝐀𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐄𝐒 Formation, where Joaquinraptor was unearthed, preserves floodplain environments teeming with crocodiliforms, fish, small mammals, and herds of sauropods. In these landscapes, megaraptors were the undisputed terrestrial hunters. In contrast, farther north in South America, different lineages, including Abelisaurids, and possibly even Carcharodontosaurids earlier in the Cretaceous, took the apex role. This patchwork distribution reminds us that apex predator is not a universal badge, but a context-dependent role, shaped by geography, prey, and competition. Yet the title of apex predator is more precarious than it sounds. To rule is not to be invincible. It is to balance at the top of a fragile pyramid. Megaraptors depended on abundant herbivores, predictable water sources, and ecological stability. As climates shifted and habitats fragmented in the final stretch of the Cretaceous, their dominance may have become more tenuous. Evidence suggests seasonal rainfall and cycles of drought challenged ecosystems in Patagonia. To survive, predators like Joaquinraptor may have needed to widen their diets, scavenging crocodiles or targeting smaller prey when sauropods became scarce. In such fluctuations, even the rulers of Patagonia could be forced into opportunism. When you compare north and south, it is tempting to ask which predator was better, T-Rex or the Megaraptors. But paleontology resists such simple comparisons. They never met, and their prey bases differed. What matters is not which could win in a fantasy matchup, but how each lineage solved the puzzle of survival in its own corner of the world. In the north, gigantism of jaws won the day. In the south, elongation of arms and claws proved successful. Each was an apex predator perfectly tailored to its land, and both would vanish almost simultaneously when the asteroid struck. The kingdom of Patagonia's Megaraptors was therefore real but fleeting, lasting only a few million years at most. Today, when we find fossils like Joaquinraptor, we glimpse the climax of that kingdom's story, right at its end. These predators walked the floodplains under skies already counting down toward impact, ruling an ecosystem as intricate and precarious as any on Earth. Their reign was not mythic or eternal, it was a product of specific circumstances, fragile and temporary, yet no less real. And so the question becomes, how many other predator kingdoms existed scattered across continents we have yet to fully sample? If Patagonia crowned Megaraptors, what did Antarctica, India or smaller islands host in those final days? The fossil record answers only in fragments, leaving us to piece together the reality of ecosystems just before everything changed. When you look at Joaquinraptor standing at the very brink of extinction, it is tempting to forget how deep the history of its kind runs. This animal was not a sudden arrival in Patagonia, but the final leaf on a long evolutionary branch that stretched across nearly 70 million years of Earth's history. To appreciate what it meant for a Megaraptor to survive until the asteroid, we need to trace their story back to the very beginning, when the world itself looked very different. The earliest known Megaraptorans come from Southeast Asia. Around 130 million years ago, in what we call the Valangenian to Hauterivian stages of the early Cretaceous, the humid lowlands of Thailand gave rise to 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒𝐒. This predator already showed the hallmark features of the group: elongated arms, curved claws, and slender jaws lined with blade-like teeth. Yet compared to its later relatives, it was modest in size, perhaps reaching only 5 or 6 meters. It was, in many ways, a starting blueprint, carrying the skeletal hints of a lineage that would one day rise to continental dominance. From these beginnings, the record is patchy but telling. A close relative, 𝐕Raptor nongbualamfuensis, also roamed Thailand in roughly the same interval. Both species anchor the base of the Megaraptoran family tree in Asia, and they show that the group was already distinct from other theropods early on. Their discovery suggests an Asian origin for Megaraptors, though fossils from Japan and other parts of East Asia may one day shift this picture. Still, the point is clear. By 120 million years ago, Megaraptors had established themselves as recognizable predators. The next major fossils come from farther east in what is now Japan. Fukuiraptor kitadaniensis, discovered in the Kitadani quarry, dates to the Aptian stage, around 125 to 115 million years ago. Fukuiraptor has sometimes been considered a transitional form, bridging earlier small-bodied ancestors with the larger, more specialized later Megaraptors. Its claws are massive, even by the standards of the group, and they hinted to early researchers that Megaraptors might be closely related to dromaeosaurs, the sickle-clawed raptors popularized by cinema. That classification would later shift, but the fossil still reminds us how easy it is to be deceived by a single dramatic feature. Meanwhile, Megaraptors had already begun their journey south. By the middle of the Cretaceous, around 105 to 95 million years ago, fossils from Australia show their presence on the continent of Gondwana. Australovenator wintonensis is perhaps the best known of these, excavated from the Winton Formation of Queensland. Nicknamed Banjo, it is among the most complete Megaraptor skeletons yet found. Australovenator was agile, perhaps around 6 meters long, with grasping hands and recurved claws. It hunted in an ecosystem full of titanosaurs and ornithopods, suggesting a flexible diet and behaviour. Its discovery confirmed that Megaraptors were not just an Asian curiosity. They had spread widely across the southern continents. By this point, the timeline reveals a remarkable pattern. Megaraptors endured across tens of millions of years and across great distances. They adapted to different continents, climates and faunas, while retaining their distinctive long arms and claws. This resilience alone is striking. Many theropod groups rose and fell in much shorter spans, but Megaraptors held on, quietly refining their design. It is in South America, however, that they reached their zenith. The continent's fossil beds tell us that by around 90 million years ago, Megaraptors were firmly established in Patagonia. Species like Megaraptor barrosiensis and Erosteon rheocoloradensis reveal a shift toward larger body sizes and more extensive skeletal pneumatization, bones riddled with air sacs that lighten their mass while preserving strength. This may have been an adaptation to reaching truly giant proportions without sacrificing agility. In these Patagonian forms, the lineage that began in Asia had become a dominant predator of Gondwana. Later in the Cretaceous, around 80 to 70 million years ago, Macrothorax emerged as one of the largest known megaraptors, stretching to lengths of 9 meters. Found in southern Patagonia, Mape underscored the trend toward gigantism. The name itself, drawn from a local 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐄𝐒𝐒 mythic figure of death, hints at how intimidating these predators must have been. By now, megaraptors were no longer fringe hunters, but apex predators commanding ecosystems full of titanosaurs and other herbivores. Finally, at the close of the Cretaceous, Joaquinraptor casali entered the record. Dating to the very end of the Maastrichtian stage, roughly 67 to 66 million years ago, it represents the youngest and one of the most complete megaraptors ever found. Its partial skeleton confirms that this lineage did not vanish earlier, but survived right up to the asteroid impact. In this sense, Joaquinraptor is both an ending and a survival, a testament to the endurance of megaraptors, and also a reminder that even the most successful predators could not escape planetary catastrophe. What is striking about this timeline is not only its length, but its continuity. From 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 in Thailand to Joaquinraptor in Patagonia, megaraptors spanned nearly 70 million years. They crossed continents as land masses drifted apart, adapting to environments that range from humid Asian forests to arid Patagonian floodplains. They never achieved the fame of Tyrannosaurs or Allosaurs, yet they quietly matched them in longevity and in ecological impact within their territories, and still, so much is missing. The record is sparse, with long gaps and fragmentary specimens. We know they existed in places where fossils have not yet been found, and we suspect that their diversity was greater than the handful of species we have named. How many other megaraptors lived and died unrecorded? How many predators held dominion over corners of Gondwana we will never uncover? Each new discovery shifts the map and stretches the timeline further. So when we ask how megaraptors managed to survive for nearly 70 million years, the answer may lie not in one trait, but in adaptability itself. They never locked into a single design the way Tyrannosaurs did, but retained long arms, powerful claws, and lightened skeletons that gave them versatility. That flexibility allowed them to thrive on multiple continents and in ecosystems that changed again and again until the asteroid's shadow fell. Their story is not one of sudden dominance, but of persistence, a quiet longevity that ended only with the most dramatic extinction in Earth's history. To extend the flow of the Megaraptor timeline without repeating what we have already covered, let us slow the pacing and lean into two areas that often get less attention: the changing world these animals inhabited and the fossil record's silences. Both are crucial for understanding why the Megaraptor's story is both long and strangely elusive. When we speak of 70 million years of survival, it is easy to compress that span into a neat line of succession, one species after another marching across continents. But in truth, these animals lived through profound environmental transformations. The earliest megaraptors in Asia walked a world dominated by conifers, cycads, and warm monsoonal climates. By the time Australovenator prowled in Australia tens of millions of years later, flowering plants were beginning to spread, reshaping the diets of herbivores, and in turn, the hunting strategies of carnivores. By the age of Joaquinraptor in Patagonia, the landscapes had shifted yet again into open floodplains dotted with seasonal lakes and drier scrublands. The adaptability of megaraptors is underscored by their persistence through such transitions, each time slotting themselves back into the role of major predators, even as the stage beneath them changed. Equally striking are the long gaps in their record. In Asia, we see tantalizing fossils in the early Cretaceous, and then the trail fades. In Australia, a few specimens bridge the mid-Cretaceous, but even there, preservation is sporadic. South America is richer, yet even in Patagonia the megaraptors appear in fragments, with only a handful of skeletons complete enough to draw firm conclusions. These silences are not necessarily signs of absence, but of how little of the Earth preserves its deep past. For a lineage that lasted 70 million years, we are working with perhaps half a dozen reasonably complete specimens. That scarcity explains why debate over their classification has been so persistent. Paleontologists have been asked to reconstruct an entire evolutionary arc from what amounts to scattered snapshots. The continuity of megaraptors across such gaps raises questions of resilience. How did they endure through environmental upheavals that extinguished many other theropod families? One possibility is that their generalist predatory design, long arms, slicing claws, and lightly built skeletons, gave them ecological flexibility. Unlike hyper-specialists, they may have been able to shift between prey types, moving from small ornithopods to juvenile sauropods to aquatic reptiles as availability shifted. Another possibility is geographic luck. South America and Australia may have provided refuges when climates or ecosystems elsewhere grew harsher, allowing megaraptors to persist until new opportunities arose. And then, of course, there is the unresolved question of just how diverse they truly were. Did the line from 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐿 to Joaquinraptor represent a narrow lineage eking out survival? Or was it the visible edge of a much broader radiation, with many species yet to be uncovered? The few we know could be only the survivors of once wider branches. Each new find, like Mape or Joaquinraptor, reshapes the tree, sometimes moving entire groups around. In that sense, the Megaraptor timeline is not fixed but alive, expanding each decade as new discoveries fill in the blanks. So the longevity of megaraptors is not simply a matter of dates, but of perspective. They lived through changing continents, shifting climates, and evolving plant and prey communities. They endured gaps in the fossil record where their story seemed lost, and when they reappeared, whether in Queensland, New Cairn, or Chubut, they did so not as relics but as thriving predators, fully integrated into their ecosystems. To survive nearly 70 million years was not to be unchanged, but to remain adaptable, always reworking the same predatory tools to match a new stage. And in that quiet persistence, they remind us that even in extinction, some lineages leave behind echoes longer than we expect. The moment you hear the word raptor, it is almost impossible not to summon an image forged by popular culture. Clawed predators leaping in coordinated attacks, eyes flashing with intelligence, and packs working together like wolves to bring down prey larger than themselves. This vision has been etched into our collective imagination ever since the early 90s, when a certain film rebranded Velociraptor from a modest turkey-sized dinosaur into a choreographed killing machine. So when paleontologists first uncovered the enormous hooked claws of megaraptors, it was perhaps inevitable that the myth of pack hunting would be attached to them. But what do we really know about the behaviour of these animals? And is there any evidence at all that they move through Patagonia like cinematic hunters? The reveal is sobering. The truth is that no fossil of Joaquinraptor or its relatives comes with a behavioural label attached. We have bones, not stories. Paleontologists must extract behaviour from indirect evidence, wear on teeth, healed injuries, bone accumulations, and comparisons to living animals. For cooperative hunting, the evidence must be especially strong, because group behaviour is one of the hardest things to pin down in deep time. The first line of reasoning often invoked is biomechanics. Megaraptors had long, powerful arms tipped with hypertrophied claws. These claws would have been formidable weapons, capable of slicing flesh and perhaps grappling prey. To use them effectively, a predator might benefit from a coordinated strategy, one individual distracting, another slashing from the side. The claws themselves inspire the possibility of pack tactics. But this is speculation born from imagination more than data. A single predator could use its arms just as well on its own, ambushing or overpowering prey without assistance. Another line of argument comes from prey size. Patagonia in the late Cretaceous was home to giant sauropods, some weighing dozens of tons. Could a lone Megaraptor reasonably hope to kill such a creature? Perhaps not. The logic then follows that they must have hunted in groups to bring down these titans, much like lions work together to fell a buffalo. Yet here again, the fossil record offers no confirming evidence. Large predators often scavenge or target vulnerable individuals. Juvenile sauropods, sick adults, or smaller herbivores may have provided ample food without requiring coordinated hunts. The presence of immense prey does not automatically prove pack hunting. Occasionally, bone beds are sighted. In some parts of the world, accumulations of multiple individuals of the same predatory species have been discovered together. This has sometimes been interpreted as evidence of social behaviour. Yet with Megaraptors, such bone beds are lacking. We do not have sites where multiple individuals of Joaquinraptor are preserved in association with prey. Without that kind of direct context, the claim of pack hunting remains ungrounded. Comparisons with modern animals are tempting but dangerous. Wolves, lions, and hyenas are social hunters. But most big cats, including tigers and leopards, are solitary. Crocodiles often congregate but rarely coordinate. Birds of prey, the closest living relatives of dinosaurs, tend to hunt alone, with only a few exceptions. Behaviour is flexible and variable across lineages. There is no rule that claws plus large prey equals pack hunting. Some paleontologists argue that the very design of Megaraptors points toward individual specialization rather than cooperation. Their skeletons suggest agility and a relatively lightweight build. These were not ambush hunters crashing into prey en masse, but active, mobile predators capable of rapid pursuit. A single Megaraptor could strike with claws and teeth, inflicting serious wounds that bled a victim into submission. Efficiency did not require a pack. It required patience and precision. This does not mean group behaviour was impossible. It only means we cannot demonstrate it. Some modern predators show facultative cooperation. They usually hunt alone, but occasionally take advantage of another's presence. Crocodiles, for example, may attack together when prey is abundant, not out of strategy, but because opportunity overlaps. Megaraptors could have done something similar, not as organised packs, but as opportunists who tolerated one another when circumstances allowed. The persistence of the pack hunter myth tells us more about ourselves than about the animals. We are drawn to narratives that mirror our own social lives. Humans are cooperative hunters. We project that pattern backward onto predators with claws. The cinematic influence reinforces it, embedding the idea so deeply that even sober scientific names like Megaraptor evoke visions of coordinated strikes. But paleontology must resist projection. The fossil record is not obliged to tell stories that flatter our expectations. So what can we say, humbly, as scientists? We can say that Megaraptors were powerful predators, capable of preying on large animals, and that their claws were central to their strategy. We can say they lived in ecosystems with abundant prey, both massive and small. We can say they may have tolerated one another in certain circumstances, but that the evidence for coordinated hunting is absent. To go further is to enter speculation, and speculation can quickly become myth. The pack hunter problem, then, is really a problem of evidence. Without trackways of multiple individuals moving together, without bone beds of predators and prey and obvious association, without repeated patterns that clearly indicate group kills, the claim cannot stand. Until such fossils appear, Megaraptors remain enigmatic, their social lives hidden. The claws can tell us about power and mechanics. They cannot tell us about cooperation. And perhaps the deeper question is this: do we need them to have hunted in packs to find them fascinating? Or is the mystery of the solitary Megaraptor stalking alone through the floodplains of Patagonia enough? The absence of proof is not proof of absence, but it is also not licensed to fill the silence with our wishes. Sometimes the most humbling thing we can say is that the claws leave us only with possibilities, not certainties. To expand on the question of whether Megaraptors truly hunted together, it is useful to step sideways into lines of evidence that are often overlooked: tracks, bite marks, and the broader context of predator guilds. None of these give us certainty, but each helps outline the boundaries of what was possible. Dinosaur trackways can sometimes capture behaviour frozen in stone. Parallel sets of footprints have been used to argue that certain theropods, and even early sauropods, may have moved in groups. Yet for Megaraptors, no such trackways have been identified. This absence might be due to preservation bias, but it also serves as a reminder of how rarely social behaviour leaves a direct geological signature. If Megaraptors did move together, they left no long fossilised marches across floodplains to prove it. Tooth marks tell another story. Predators often leave their calling cards on the bones of their victims. In some ecosystems, multiple sets of tooth marks from different individuals on the same skeleton suggest shared feeding events. In Patagonia, sauropod bones with predatory scoring are not rare, but they rarely allow us to distinguish one carnivore from another. Megaraptors had slender, blade-like teeth, not the crushing dentition of a tyrannosaur. Their bite marks would have been slashing grooves rather than punctures, but in the weathered fossil record these subtleties are easily lost. Without distinct tooth marks, the case for communal feeding remains circumstantial at best. A broader question lies in the structure of predator communities. In Patagonia during the late Cretaceous, Megaraptors coexisted with smaller abelisaurids, crocodiliforms, and an array of opportunistic scavengers. In such a crowded guild, a solitary hunting style might actually be advantageous. Groups of predators leave larger signatures and require larger kills, raising the risk of conflict with competitors. Solitary hunters can slip between niches, targeting prey when opportunity arises without drawing attention. From this perspective, Megaraptors may have thrived precisely because they did not rely on cooperation. Still, it is worth acknowledging the hints that occasionally stir the imagination. One is the sheer repeatability of claw hypertrophy across the lineage. Over tens of millions of years from Megaraptor to Joaquinraptor, evolution retained and enlarged those grasping hands. Such exaggeration might suggest a predatory style that benefited from multiple attackers, each exploiting the prey's vulnerability. Another hint comes from modern analogues not in birds but in reptiles. Komodo dragons, while primarily solitary, are known to congregate at kills. The result is not pack coordination but a tense, temporary gathering where size dictates who feeds first. Could Megaraptors have behaved in a similar way, occasionally sharing access to a carcass under uneasy truce? What this all underscores is that behaviour exists on a spectrum. The dichotomy between pack hunter and solitary stalker may be misleading. A Megaraptor might have hunted alone most of the time but tolerated another individual at a rich feeding site. Juveniles might have shadowed adults for a time, learning by proximity rather than active cooperation. None of this leaves a neat signature in the rock record, but it is biologically plausible, and it sits in the grey space between myth and certainty. Ultimately, the pack hunter problem reveals how much of paleontology is conducted in the negative space of silence. We are forced to weigh what we do not see against what we imagine. It is tempting to fill the void with cinematic visions, but perhaps restraint is the more scientific posture. Until fossils offer clearer clues, Megaraptors remain solitary on paper, not because we know they hunted alone, but because the evidence for anything else has yet to emerge. And in that uncertainty lies their enduring fascination. When paleontologists lifted the bones of Joaquinraptor from the ground, they were struck not only by their size but by their texture. These were not the solid, heavy pillars of a crocodile or the dense supports of a mammal. Instead, many were riddled with cavities, thin-walled, almost fragile to the touch, yet perfectly preserved in stone. This lightness was not a weakness but a signature. It revealed that Joaquinraptor, like its kin, carried air in its skeleton. Its bones breathed. At first glance, hollow bones seem counterintuitive for a predator. Power, after all, is often imagined as weight and density. Yet evolution repeatedly finds that lightness can be strength. In Megaraptors, postcranial pneumaticity, the invasion of bones by air sacs connected to the respiratory system, reduced mass without sacrificing stability. Vertebrae, ribs, even parts of the limb girdles bore internal chambers, each connected to the flow of air that once passed through the animal's lungs. This system is familiar to us not because we see it in reptiles, but because we see it in birds. The revelation here is that long before the asteroid fell, Megaraptors were already borrowing from the blueprint of avian respiration. Pneumatic bones suggest that their breathing was not like that of mammals, with a diaphragm pushing air in and out, but closer to the unidirectional flow of birds. Air sacs would have pushed oxygen-rich air through the lungs in a continuous cycle, making the system more efficient than tidal breathing. For a predator chasing prey across hot floodplains, such efficiency could mean the difference between collapse and survival. The spread of pneumaticity in Megaraptors is striking. In many theropods, air sacs are limited to the neck and chest. In Megaraptors, they extended deep into the body, even into the tail. This mirrors what we see in advanced tyrannosauroids, but with its own pattern. The bones of Joaquinraptor show that air reached into the ribs, hollowing them, and perhaps lightening the entire torso. For an animal that relied on speed and agility, this was a profound adaptation. A body that looked massive could move with the relative quickness of a lighter frame. But pneumatization is not only about weight reduction, it also intersects with metabolism. Efficient lungs are the engine of high activity. If Megaraptors breathed like birds, they may have maintained elevated metabolic rates compared to cold-blooded reptiles. That does not mean they were warm-blooded in the mammalian sense, but it places them closer to the high-energy lifestyles we associate with modern endotherms. They were predators built for stamina, for pursuit, for an active way of life. The claws tell us how they killed, but the bones tell us how they sustained the chase. The link to birds is tempting to overstate. One might be drawn to see Megaraptors as half-avian hunters, already partway to flight. Yet it is crucial to remember that pneumatization appeared many times in theropods, not only in the line that led to birds. Air-filled bones were an experiment run in parallel across multiple groups, sometimes convergent, sometimes inherited from deeper ancestry. For Megaraptors, it was not about wings but about running, grappling and surviving in a world of giants. There is also the question of vulnerability. Pneumatic bones can be strong but are more fragile under compression. A predator with such bones needed to strike carefully. One can imagine claws and jaws doing the heavy work, while the skeleton beneath stayed light, trading in vulnerability for speed. This balance, to be quick but not brittle, may explain why Megaraptors never reached the sheer bulk of Tyrannosaurus rex. Their design emphasized maneuverability rather than immovable mass. Histological studies add further detail. Under the microscope, the walls of pneumatic cavities are lined with secondary lamellar bone, sometimes preserving fibers that may indicate the tissues through which air once flowed. In Joaquinraptor, these structures confirm that the cavities were not random erosions but part of a living respiratory architecture. Each hollowed vertebra was not an empty shell but a component of a dynamic breathing machine. Why did Megaraptors push pneumaticity so far? Part of the answer may be their ecological stage. Living alongside colossal sauropods, they needed to cover ground quickly and exploit opportunities when they arose. A lightened skeleton would have made them efficient movers across floodplains, conserving energy during long patrols. In climates that swung between wet and dry seasons, efficiency was survival. Every breath had to count. The broader implication is that Megaraptors blur the lines we try to draw. Were they reptiles? Yes. Were they bird-like? In many ways, also, yes. They remind us that the boundaries we imagine between categories are often porous. The predator standing in Patagonia at the end of the Cretaceous was both ancient and modern, drawing on traits we now see perfected in sparrows and hawks. And yet, the truth is incomplete. Not every bone of Joaquinraptor is preserved, and not every cavity can be mapped. We suspect pneumatization, we trace it where we can, but we cannot reconstruct the entire system. Did air sacs extend into the pelvis, into the distal tail? The evidence is partial, the answer's open. What we can say is that this predator was lighter and more efficient than its frame suggests, breathing through bones that carried air as well as blood. Perhaps the deeper mystery is this: how many other dinosaurs had breathing bones we have not yet recognized? And how many solutions to the problem of respiration existed, running in parallel across deep time, only to be erased by extinction? In Joaquinraptor, we glimpse one path: a predator whose skeleton was not only structure but lung, not only support but breath. One of the subtler aspects of pneumaticity in Megaraptors is the way it may have influenced their balance and posture. By hollowing out the vertebrae and ribs, air sacs shifted the distribution of mass within the body. Instead of carrying the full weight of a dense torso, Joaquinraptor bore a frame that was internally lighter, perhaps allowing finer control when pivoting during a chase or when bracing against the struggles of prey. In this sense, the air-filled bones were not only a metabolic advantage, but a biomechanical one, letting a large predator handle itself with surprising agility. There is also an evolutionary context worth considering. Pneumatization did not arise in isolation. In theropods, it is often accompanied by elongation of neck vertebrae and changes in the ribcage that accommodate greater lung expansion. In Megaraptors, the evidence points to a respiratory system that was becoming deeply integrated with their skeletal architecture. This hints at an evolutionary pressure that consistently rewarded lighter, more efficient hunters. Their success across millions of years suggests that pneumatization was not a minor adaptation, but a central pillar of their design. Interestingly, pneumatic bones may also have had a thermal role. By channeling air deep into the skeleton, these dinosaurs could regulate body temperature more effectively, flushing heat away from vital organs during exertion. In the warm floodplains of Cretaceous Patagonia, overheating would have been as deadly as starvation. The capacity to move air not only through the lungs but through the very bones may have allowed Megaraptors to hunt during hotter parts of the day, exploiting windows of opportunity when competitors slowed. There is a humbling element in all of this. Pneumatic bones fossilise well enough to be recognised, but the air sacs themselves, the soft tissues that made them function, are long gone. We reconstruct them from cavities and channels, inferring their pathways through educated comparisons to birds. But we cannot see the sacs themselves. It is like trying to understand a machine by looking only at the hollows left behind in its casing. What is missing is as instructive as what remains, and yet even from these absences a pattern emerges. Megaraptors were not accidents of anatomy, but refined products of evolutionary trial. Their bones tell us that power and speed were achieved not by growing ever denser and heavier, but by learning to breathe through the skeleton itself. In a predator that stood near the end of the dinosaur era, this was both a survival strategy and a glimpse into the physiology that would later take to the skies. In Joaquinraptor, the hollow bones remind us that even in the largest predators, air was as vital as flesh. When we picture a predator, we often imagine a battle of muscle and tooth, a raw contest of force. But in truth, no hunter survives on strength alone. Survival depends on perception, on knowing where to move, when to strike, and how to anticipate the reaction of prey. This is where the brain and senses enter the story of Joaquinraptor. Were these Megaraptors calculating stalkers with sharp sensory maps of their surroundings, or were they blunt instruments of instinct, reacting only to immediate motion and opportunity? The skull of Joaquinraptor, though incomplete, preserves enough detail to open a window into its cranial anatomy. CT scans of related Megaraptors and other theropods suggest that their brain cases were not as cavernous as those of birds, but neither were they simple hollows. They housed elongated olfactory tracts, vestibular systems tuned to balance, and optic lobes that likely commanded a significant portion of processing power. This combination hints at predators more aware of their environment than their lumbering size might suggest. One of the most striking features is the olfactory region. In many theropods, including tyrannosauroids, the canals leading from the snout to the brain were enlarged, suggesting a keen sense of smell. Megaraptors, too, seem to have possessed elongated olfactory bulbs, which may have allowed them to detect prey or carrion across long distances. In a landscape as vast as the Cretaceous floodplains of Patagonia, such sensitivity would have been invaluable. Smell may have guided them not only to fresh kills, but also to waterholes where herbivores congregated. Vision is harder to pin down, but the general proportions of the skull suggest forward-facing eyes. If so, this would have provided a degree of binocular overlap, enhancing depth perception. The benefit here is obvious. A predator swinging enormous claws cannot afford to misjudge distance. Accurate gauging of space would have meant the difference between a clean strike and a wasted effort. Even if their visual acuity did not rival that of modern raptors or owls, it was likely strong enough to support predatory precision. balance and coordination are encoded in the vestibular system of the inner ear. Endocasts of theropod skulls reveal the curvature of semicircular canals which track head movement. In Megaraptors, these canals appear elongated, suggesting that they were capable of rapid head adjustments and fine equilibrium control. For an animal wielding long arms and striking claws, this agility was critical. It meant they could pivot mid-stride, snap their head toward fleeing prey, and recover quickly from lunges. Agility is not only about legs and muscles, it is about a brain that knows where the body is in space. But does all this make them clever? Here we must tread carefully. Brain size is a slippery metric. Compared to mammals, most dinosaurs had brains that seemed small for their bodies. But relative to reptiles, many theropods show expansion in sensory regions, indicating that intelligence was expressed not in abstract reasoning, but in sensory-motor integration. A Megaraptor was not likely planning elaborate strategies, but it was attuned, able to process smell, sight, and balance into coordinated predation. Evidence from cranial pneumatization also suggests that their brains were cooled by air sacs, much like those of birds. This may sound trivial, but temperature regulation is critical to neural performance. A predator whose brain overheats loses clarity. One with an internal cooling system can remain sharp longer during pursuit. It is another layer of efficiency folded into their design. We sometimes imagine intelligence as a hierarchy, with humans at the top and everything else descending. But in truth, intelligence is plural. A Megaraptor's mind was not built for language or tools. It was built for survival, for navigating a complex ecosystem with a predator's awareness. Its cleverness lay not in thought experiments, but in the seamless fusion of sensory input and physical action. And so, when we ask whether Megaraptors were clever killers or blunt instruments, the answer lies in perspective. They were not clever in the way a primate is clever, nor blunt like a crocodile's lunge. They were something else. Animals finely tuned by evolution to be responsive, aware, and agile in their role as hunters. They knew their world through smell, vision, and balance, and they acted within it with precision born of instinct and perception. The fossils give us the dimensions of brain cavities and sensory canals, but the inner life, the awareness that guided a clawed hand toward living flesh, remains elusive. We will never know what it felt like to be inside the mind of Joaquinraptor. We can only trace the outlines of its brain and senses and admit that, for an animal that vanished 66 million years ago, even those outlines are remarkable. One of the subtler points about brain and sensory adaptation in Megaraptors is how it may have shaped their daily rhythm. Not all predators hunt under the same light. Some thrive in full daylight, others in the twilight margins, and still others in the dead of night. While we cannot reconstruct the eye's soft tissues, the bony orbits of Megaraptors suggest a balance rather than an extreme. Their eyes were not oversized like those of strictly nocturnal hunters, nor were they tiny slits suited only for blazing sun. Instead, they likely operated as opportunistic predators, capable of shifting between daylight and dusk, using smell to supplement vision when light was poor. Such flexibility may have made them less predictable to prey, and more resilient in ecosystems where competition pressed hard on available resources. Another dimension often overlooked is the role of hearing. The inner ear not only tracks balance, but also receives sound. Reconstructions of theropod cochlea, the spiral structures that process auditory input, suggest they could hear in ranges similar to modern birds. For a Megaraptor, this may have meant the ability to detect low-frequency vibrations, like the rumble of the large herbivores moving across floodplains, as well as higher-pitched calls of smaller animals. Sound would have layered onto smell and sight, giving them a multi-dimensional map of their environment. Predators with overlapping sensory channels are better at confirming information. What is smelled can be matched to what is heard. What is glimpsed can be confirmed by the rustle of movement. Intelligence, in this context, was not about self-reflection, but about integration. A Megaraptor brain did not need to solve puzzles. It needed to unite streams of sensory data into instantaneous decisions. When to lunge, when to withdraw, when to track, and when to wait. This is a form of cognition we often undervalue because it does not mirror our own. Yet for a predator, it is precisely this form of embodied intelligence that matters most. It is also worth considering how such sensory tuning affected social interaction. Even if Megaraptors were not pack hunters, they must have recognised competitors, avoided rivals, and perhaps detected potential mates over distance. Olfactory acuity and auditory sensitivity would have played roles here, shaping not just hunting but survival in a broader sense. Their brains were wired not only for killing, but for living within a network of signals, the scent trails of others, the distant calls of prey, the subtle vibrations of footsteps in the soil. When we frame the question as clever killers versus blunt instruments, we risk missing this third possibility. Megaraptors as sensory specialists, alive to a world of signals we can only faintly imagine. Their intelligence was not in words or tools but in perception itself, a sharpness of awareness honed over millions of years, then lost in an instant when the Cretaceous closed. It is one thing for a predator to survive across millions of years. It is another to change shape entirely, scaling up from a mid-sized hunter into a giant that dominated the southern continents. This is the story of Megaraptors in the mid to late Cretaceous, somewhere between their origins in Asia and their rise in Patagonia. These clawed theropods shifted gears. By the time Mate Macrothorax and Joaquinraptor casali appeared in Argentina, they had grown into predators more than 7 meters long, heavier, more imposing, and more central to their ecosystems than any of their early relatives. The puzzle is why this transformation happened and what pressures drove these animals into gigantism. The first clue comes from geography. During the early Cretaceous, South America was becoming increasingly isolated as the supercontinent of Gondwana fragmented. Land bridges that once allowed easy movement between Africa, South America and Australia were disappearing. Isolation tends to drive ecological experimentation. Without large tyrannosaurids in the southern hemisphere, a gap opened at the top of the predator hierarchy. Megaraptors stepped into that gap. At first modestly sized, they soon expanded to fill the role of apex hunters, growing larger as prey size demanded. The prey itself was extraordinary. Patagonia was one of the strongholds of sauropods, not only surviving but thriving at the end of the Cretaceous. Titanosaurs reached astonishing dimensions, some among the heaviest creatures to ever walk the earth. Each predator confronted with such giants faced two choices: adapt to smaller game or scale up to compete with the massive herbivores directly. Megaraptors seem to have taken the second path. By enlarging their bodies, they could handle bigger prey, whether through active predation on juveniles or by asserting dominance over carcasses. The anatomy reflects this scaling. Early Megaraptors like Phylogeny and Australovenator were agile but lightly built, roughly in the range of 5 to 6 meters. By contrast, South American species such as Mape stretched past 9 meters in some estimates. Joaquinraptor may not have reached those extremes, but its skeleton shows the proportions of an animal that had bulked up compared to its distant Asian cousins. Limbs became sturdier, vertebrae more expanded and claws larger still, suggesting that size itself had become a selective advantage. Climate and environment played their role. Patagonia in the late Cretaceous was not an arid wasteland but a mosaic of floodplains, forests and wetlands. Productivity was high, meaning abundant herbivores, which in turn supported large predators. In such a system, energy could flow into building giants. This is the same dynamic that allowed sauropods to reach such extraordinary scale, and it likely shaped their hunters as well. Where the land was rich, the bodies of its predators grew to match. Another possibility lies in competition. South America was home to Abelisaurids, another group of theropods with their own claim to the predator niche. Abelisaurids had distinctive short, blunt skulls and reduced forearms, relying on strong jaws rather than claws. They often reached medium sizes, but only a few rivaled the scale of Megaraptors. The arms race between lineages may have encouraged Megaraptors to push larger, establishing themselves in a different predatory bracket. Where Abelisaurids targeted smaller prey or engaged in ambush, Megaraptors, with their longer builds and hypertrophied claws, may have pursued larger quarry in open ground. Scaling up was a way of owning a distinct ecological space. The timing of this size increase is not trivial. It coincides with the late Cretaceous diversification of titanosaurs and the continued flourishing of large ornithopods. Rather than being a gradual drift, the jump to giant size appears to have been a response to ecological opportunity. In South America, prey scaled up, and so too did the predators. In evolutionary terms, it was a logical escalation. But scaling up is never free. Larger bodies mean longer growth times, greater caloric demands, and increased risk of starvation when prey runs low. Megaraptors may have managed this trade-off by retaining their lightweight skeletal structure, riddled with air sacs that kept them agile despite their mass. They were giants by length, but not as stocky as tyrannosaurs. This allowed them to grow large without becoming slow. They were big but still mobile. What we see in Joaquinraptor is the culmination of this southern trajectory. By the last 2 or 3 million years of the Cretaceous, Megaraptors had reached a scale sufficient to rival most other predators in their environment. They were not the heaviest of hunters. They never matched the bulk of Tyrannosaurus rex. But they were long, armed with oversized claws and capable of dominating their ecological stage. So why did South American Megaraptors get big? The best answer is that evolution abhors a vacuum. In the absence of tyrannosaurids, and in the presence of giant herbivores, Megaraptors rose to fill the role of apex predator. Isolation gave them the opportunity, prey abundance gave them the resources, and their own anatomy gave them the tools. By the end of the Cretaceous, they had become rulers of the southern continent, as much a symbol of Patagonia as T-Rex was of North America. And yet their size reminds us of a deeper truth. To scale up is to gamble on stability. When the asteroid struck, the gamble ended. Giants require continuity, and continuity was the one thing the Cretaceous could no longer provide. The story of size in Megaraptors is also a story of growth strategy. A predator does not simply hatch at 7 meters long. It must pass through vulnerable stages, smaller bodies that risk predation themselves. One intriguing idea is that Megaraptors may have occupied different ecological roles at different ages, a concept known as ontogenetic niche partitioning. Juveniles, light and fast, may have pursued small prey like lizards, mammals, or hatchling dinosaurs. As they grew, their size allowed them to graduate to larger herbivores. This gradual transition would have spread pressure across the ecosystem, ensuring that Megaraptors of various ages did not all compete directly with one another for food. Such a strategy could help explain how such large predators persisted in significant numbers. There is also the question of biomechanics. Growing larger meant not just scaling up bones, but re-engineering the way a body functioned. The long arms and oversized claws of Megaraptors had to work differently on a 7-meter animal than on a 4-meter one. Larger arms could exert more leverage, but also carried greater inertia. The musculature of the shoulder and chest would have had to thicken to control them. Likewise, the legs would have borne new stresses. To run and pivot with such mass required skeletal reinforcement, and yet Megaraptors somehow retained a degree of agility. Their elongate, lightly built frames may have been one answer. They grew long before they grew bulky. Another layer of this scaling puzzle lies in reproduction. Larger predators tend to produce fewer, slower-growing offspring, investing more time in each. If Megaraptors followed this pattern, their populations may have been smaller and more vulnerable to fluctuations in prey. Yet the very fact that multiple large individuals appear in the fossil record hints at some balance between reproductive rate and ecological stability. Patagonia must have offered a consistently rich environment to sustain them. And here lies a humbling reminder. Size is not merely an advantage, it is also a liability. To be large is to need more food, to be more exposed to droughts or sudden shortages, to be less able to hide. Megaraptors grew big because the late Cretaceous of South America allowed it. But when conditions shifted, whether through climate pulses or ultimately the asteroid, that very scale became a burden. The giants of Patagonia are a testament to how evolution exploits opportunity, and how quickly opportunity can vanish. In the bones of Joaquinraptor we see this gamble made flesh. It was big enough to dominate its world, yet its very size tied it tightly to that world's abundance. The growth that made it a ruler also tethered it to an age that was already ending. Imagine standing in late Maastrichtian Patagonia some 66 million years ago, with the bones of Joaquinraptor still wrapped in flesh and sinew, moving through an ecosystem that was anything but empty. It is tempting to see the new Megaraptor as a solitary king lording over a barren landscape, but the truth is far more complex. Every apex predator is only as powerful as the web of life that sustains it, and in Patagonia, that web was woven with threads of enormous variety. The 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 Formation, where Joaquinraptor was unearthed, preserves a community that shows us what South America looked like at the very brink of the Cretaceous-Paleogene transition. The most imposing figures alongside Joaquinraptor were the Titanosaurs, the last of the great long-necked sauropods. Unlike their Jurassic ancestors, these Cretaceous titans were highly specialised, with stocky builds, wide stances, and in some cases even bony armour fused into their skin. They were the living skyscrapers of the ecosystem, reaching lengths of over 20 metres, casting shadows across floodplains and forest edges. For Joaquinraptor, a fully grown titanosaur was no easy prey, but perhaps their juveniles or weakened individuals offered opportunities. These sauropods shaped the landscape not just through their size, but by their constant feeding, stripping vegetation, and opening spaces that smaller animals could exploit. Their presence meant abundance, but also challenge, for any predator daring enough to test them. Alongside the giants were the Allosaurids, shorter-faced theropods that had long dominated South America. Allosaurids, like Carnotaurus and its kin, were more compact, with powerful jaws and reduced arms, their bodies seemingly designed for blunt force attacks. They were not as large as Megaraptors, but were formidable rivals, competing for mid-sized prey. The coexistence of these two predator lineages suggests niche partitioning. Where Allosaurids may have specialised in close-quarters ambush, Joaquinraptor's claws and longer build hinted at a different hunting style, perhaps involving pursuit or grappling. The fact that both thrived in the same ecosystem tells us the prey base was rich enough to support multiple apex carnivores, a remarkable feature of Cretaceous South America. Crocodiliforms also played a surprising role. These were not the relatively uniform crocodiles we know today, but a diverse array of forms. Some were sleek aquatic hunters, others strange terrestrial omnivores with unusual teeth. The fact that a crocodiliform humerus was found between the jaws of Joaquinraptor hints at direct predation or scavenging. These crocodile relatives were plentiful, offering both competition and food. Their persistence into the very end of the Cretaceous in Patagonia shows how resilient they were, even as dinosaurs dominated the land. Below this reptilian drama scurried mammals, small but not insignificant. They were not yet the rulers of the world, but they were diverse, ranging from insectivores to plant-eaters to opportunistic omnivores. In the shadow of dinosaurs, they were already experimenting with niches that would later explode in the Paleogene. Joaquinraptor would hardly have noticed them, though perhaps juveniles might have snatched one up now and then. Yet their quiet presence tells us the stage was already being set for the next age. Together, this community paints a picture of richness rather than decline. Titanosaurs kept the plant world in constant flux. Allosaurids and Megaraptors tested each other's strategies. Crocodiliforms filled streams, rivers, and even dry niches. Mammals lurked in the underbrush, waiting. Joaquinraptor was not a lonely giant, but part of this crowded theatre. Its claws, its size, its very existence were not the products of isolation, but of constant interaction with those around it. And here lies the deeper question. What does it mean that such variety persisted until the very end? Far from being a world already collapsing, late Cretaceous Patagonia thrived. If not for the asteroid, would Megaraptors and Titanosaurs still have ruled, or would mammals have risen regardless? In Joaquinraptor's world, the answer was not yet written. If we look closer at the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 Formation, we find that its community was not just defined by the giants and predators, but by the subtler layers of life that held the system together. The flora of this late Cretaceous landscape provided the foundation, and while plant fossils are less glamorous than bones, they remind us that titanosaur herds and megaraptors alike depended on the productivity of an ecosystem. Palynological studies, fossil pollen and spores, suggest that Patagonia at this time was warm, with seasonal rainfall. That meant stretches of green productivity punctuated by dry intervals, an environment that required both adaptability and resilience. Titanosaurs browsed across forests of conifers and patches of ferns, while smaller herbivorous reptiles and mammals exploited whatever niches they could carve out. Among the lesser-known reptilian contemporaries were sphenodontians and lizards, survivors from lineages that stretched back to the Triassic. For Joaquinraptor, these creatures were hardly more than background life, but their abundance indicates a robust and layered food chain. Small animals, often overlooked, provide the prey base for mid-sized predators and scavengers, which in turn feed the giants. Even insects and invertebrates would have played critical roles in decomposing plant matter and recycling nutrients, though their traces are harder to preserve in stone. Birds, too, were present. By this time, avian dinosaurs had diversified widely, with both enantiornithines and early ornithorines flitting through the skies and waterways. Their bones are fragile and rare in the fossil record, but their existence was certain. In the shadow of titanosaur herds and stalking predators, these smaller dinosaurs lived at a different pace, one that, unlike the Megaraptors, would carry them through the mass extinction. For Joaquinraptor, they may have been competitors for small prey, or, in rare cases, part of the menu themselves. One must also imagine the waterways. The rivers and lakes of the basin teemed with fish, turtles and amphibians. Fossil evidence from related deposits suggests that freshwater ecosystems were vibrant, with crocodiliforms reigning as aquatic hunters. The presence of a crocodile bone between the jaws of Joaquinraptor ties these habitats directly into the narrative of its life. It reminds us that apex predators were not bound to a single environment, but likely patrolled the edges of rivers and lakes, where prey was most vulnerable. The mammals, though small, deserve another moment of attention. They were not a monolithic group, but a patchwork of lineages, some archaic holdovers, and others experimental forms pointing toward futures we now inhabit. Docodont-like creatures, multituberculates, and early therians all left their traces in South America. While their role in the ecosystem may have been modest in biomass, their adaptability was already evident. In the quiet scurry of these creatures, we glimpse the seeds of the mammalian radiation that would follow. They remind us that even in ecosystems dominated by dinosaurs, the undercurrent of change was already flowing. Taken together, the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 ecosystem was a mosaic. Titanosaurs reshaped vegetation, Allosaurids competed with Megaraptors, crocodile kin thrived in aquatic habitats, birds flitted above, and mammals scurried below. To study Joaquinraptor without this context would be to miss the stage on which it lived. It was not an isolated oddity, but a player in a rich drama. The completeness of its skeleton gives us a privileged view of one predator, but its story cannot be told without acknowledging the chorus of other lives around it. And so we are left with the sense of a world still in full bloom, right up to the boundary. A Megaraptor claw, a titanosaur track, a mammal tooth, each is a voice in a late Cretaceous symphony that was silenced suddenly, not gradually. Joaquinraptor's neighbours are reminders that extinction does not erase richness. At the very end, Patagonia was crowded with life, and then, in the span of hours and days, it was not. In the closing act of the Cretaceous, the world was split into predator kingdoms, each continent hosting its own rulers, each lineage shaped by millions of years of isolation. It is easy to default to the North American tyrant Tyrannosaurus rex, whose reputation looms larger than life. Yet the truth is that in the 70 to 66 million year interval, Patagonia, Asia and Africa were no less rich in apex predators. Each lineage had followed a different evolutionary path, and each produced predators of staggering scale and power. So the question becomes not who was objectively the scariest, but what made each terrifying in its own way. Tyrannosaurus rex, of course, was a marvel of brute adaptation. Its skull was colossal, its teeth thickened into bone-crushing tools, its bite force among the greatest of any land animal that has ever lived. It was a predator and scavenger rolled into one, perfectly suited for the mixed environments of late Cretaceous North America. Yet it was also the product of a long, narrow lineage, a tyrannosauroid story that began as small-bodied predators in the Jurassic and swelled into kings of the north only at the very end. Its strength lay in crushing power, not finesse, its arms reduced, its head an entire weapon system. South America told a different story. In the north of the continent, Carcharodontosaurids had once reigned, but by the latest Cretaceous it was Megaraptors that had seized the throne. Joaquinraptor, the last of them, did not bite through bone in the way of a tyrannosaur. Instead, it wielded long arms with hypertrophied claws, flexible and fast compared to the more blunt northern giant. Its teeth were thinner, suited more for slicing than crushing, and its bones were lightened with air sacs, bird-like in ways that hint at a different style of predation altogether. Where Tyrannosaurus was a hammer, Megaraptors were more like hooked blades, leaning into speed and agility as much as size. Africa and parts of South America had earlier produced Giganotosaurus and its kin, the Carcharodontosaurids. These were titanic predators, longer even than most tyrannosaurs, with skulls designed for slashing rather than bone-breaking. They lived earlier, peaking in the Cenomanian around 98 million years ago, and did not overlap with the very last dinosaurs, yet their shadow lingers in comparisons. They may not have matched the crushing power of T-Rex, but they represent a form of giant predator adapted to wide-open spaces and massive sauropod prey. In them, we see another experiment in apex design, one that faded before the end but showed how many pathways evolution could take. Asia added even more variety. There, Tarbosaurids stalked the Mongolian steppes, close relatives of Tyrannosaurus but smaller in scale. Yet Asia also hosted strange predators like Alioramus with slender snouts, as well as Spinosaurids that ventured into aquatic hunting. Australia too had its own Megaraptorids, smaller than Joaquinraptor but still impressive, perhaps precursors that seeded the Patagonian giants. When we place them side by side, the comparisons feel almost unfair, as if trying to decide whether a lion or a tiger is the scarier cat. Tyrannosaurus rex embodied crushing dominance, Megaraptors embodied agility with claws and light-weighted skeletons, and Carcharodontosaurids embodied earlier gigantism with slicing power. What unites them all is the way evolution tuned each to its environment, making them perfect in their own place and time, but not necessarily beyond it. None was universally superior. Each lineage thrived until conditions changed, and then the advantage dissolved. In some sense, what makes Joaquinraptor so fascinating is that it represents the very last survivor of a style of predator different from the tyrant of the north. As the asteroid drew near, Patagonia was not ruled by a bone crusher, but by a clawed hunter that looked both backward to earlier Allosaur-like ancestors and forward to bird-like air-filled bones. Its rule was short-lived, but it was proof that multiple predator designs could coexist on Earth until the final curtain fell. So who was scarier? The answer depends on whether you fear being bitten in half, disemboweled by claws, or sliced apart by a giant's jaws. Each of these apex predators was terrifying in a way evolution had carefully sculpted, and each leaves us humbled by the diversity of paths to dominance. What unites them is not a hierarchy of fear, but the knowledge that they all vanished when the Earth itself changed, reminders that no amount of power can outlast the shifting of worlds. It is also worth remembering that these predator lineages did not evolve in isolation from their prey. The power of Tyrannosaurus rex makes little sense without the vast herds of ceratopsians and hadrosaurs it lived alongside. Its crushing jaws were adaptations to a world where armoured frills and dense bone shields made a cleaner slice less effective than the brute ability to puncture and shatter. The slicing adaptations of Giganotosaurus and its Carcharodontosaurid kin, on the other hand, mirrored the presence of gigantic sauropods in Gondwana. Those immense herbivores could not be subdued with a single bone-crushing bite, but they could be weakened and bled over time by long jaws studded with blade-like teeth. Megaraptors, in contrast, seemed to evolve in ecosystems where prey was varied and included not only juvenile titanosaurs, but also armoured crocodiliforms, mid-sized ornithopods, and anything else their claws could grasp. Their weaponry reflects a flexibility in diet, perhaps less specialised than their giant northern or African rivals, but effective in its own right. When you compare them across continents, you also see the role of isolation in shaping predator strategy. North America had split from Gondwana long before the Maastrichtian, leaving its faunas on different evolutionary tracks. In North America, tyrannosaurs replaced older allosauroids and eventually monopolised the apex role. In South America, the Megaraptors rose instead, filling the vacuum left by earlier allosaur relatives. Africa, meanwhile, saw Carcharodontosaurids rise and fall before the end, their dominance replaced by Abelisaurids in some regions. Asia, perched between, shared traits with both worlds. Its tyrannosaurs were close kin of T-Rex, but other lineages lingered longer there than elsewhere. the picture that emerges is one of regional solutions to the same ecological puzzle: how to dominate in a world of giant herbivores. Another angle is speed versus strength. Tyrannosaurus rex, despite its massive size, was not the slow, lumbering beast of outdated depictions. Its legs were proportioned for walking efficiency, allowing it to cover ground steadily, though probably not outrunning swift prey in a sprint. Megaraptors, by contrast, had lighter skeletons, hollowed with air sacs and forelimbs that suggest agility. They may not have matched tyrannosaurs for raw bite power, but they compensated with maneuverability and reach. The claws themselves were weapons that extended their strike zone, allowing them to grapple or tear with precision. In this sense, Megaraptors were predators of finesse compared to the bludgeoning style of Tyrants. Yet perhaps the most haunting realization is that none of these apex predators ever faced each other. They were separated by oceans, by time, by millions of years of divergent evolution. A Tyrannosaurus rex never met a Joaquinraptor, and Giganotosaurus was already extinct long before either drew breath. The comparisons we make are thought experiments, ways of testing the boundaries of predator design. But in reality, each was supreme only in its own theatre. The ecosystems of the Cretaceous were not a single stage, but many, each with its own script and its own cast. When we line them up side by side, the exercise is as much about us as it is about them. We crave rankings, hierarchies, competitions, because they help us grasp the diversity of life that otherwise feels unbounded. But in doing so, we risk missing the deeper story, that the Earth produced multiple parallel solutions to the problem of predation at scale. Each was terrifying, not because it was better than the others, but because it was perfectly adapted to its own vanished world. And when those worlds ended, so too did the predators, leaving only bones for us to argue over. In the end, the scariest truth may not be which predator was the most dangerous, but that all of them, in their perfection, were still temporary. When scientists first uncovered fragments of Megaraptors in the 1990s, the problem was not simply identifying what they were, but where to put them on the vast tree of theropod evolution. At first, some paleontologists thought they might be related to the classic Allosauroids, the broad family that had once given rise to monsters like Allosaurus and Giganotosaurus. The big claws, the long arms, the overall skeletal proportions seemed to fit. But with every new specimen, the story became less tidy. Over the past 3 decades, these animals have shifted positions on evolutionary diagrams like restless tenants, unable to decide which apartment to rent. The root of the problem lies in the fragmentary nature of the fossils. A hand claw here, a vertebra there, a partial skull in another quarry. Rarely do paleontologists get a skeleton with enough overlapping elements to compare directly across species. Without overlapping pieces, every analysis relies heavily on inference, coding subtle anatomical characters into vast data matrices where hundreds of species are cross-compared by their traits. When new bones are discovered, they often contradict the placement suggested by earlier data sets. The result is a lineage that seems to hop from one branch of the tree to another depending on the season. For a long time, one school of thought placed Megaraptors firmly within Allosauridae, the family of blade-toothed predators that dominated the middle and early late Cretaceous. They shared certain skull elongations, pneumatic bones, and forelimb structures that made them look like late holdouts of that group. But then came features that pulled in the opposite direction. Their vertebrae and pelvis looked more at home among the coelurosaurs, the massive radiation that included tyrannosaurs, ornithomimids, and even the lineage that gave rise to birds. Could Megaraptors actually be oversized cousins of tyrannosaurs, instead of lingering allosaur relatives? This possibility gained traction when studies highlighted traits in the ulna and maxilla that resembled tyrannosauroid patterns. Some cladistic analyses in the 2010s began to recover Megaraptors as basal tyrannosauroids, branching near the base of that lineage rather than high among allosaurs. If true, that would mean that South America had its own line of tyrant cousins that evolved to fill the same niche as T-Rex did in the north, but using different tools. For a while, this interpretation dominated headlines, with researchers suggesting Megaraptors were southern tyrannosaurs with long arms. It was a tidy narrative, but again, not the last word. By the early 2020s, new specimens such as Macrothorax and finally Joaquinraptor shifted the debate once more. These fossils brought with them more complete skeletons, including cranial and postcranial elements that could be directly compared to both Allosauroids and Coelurosaurs. Analyses incorporating these specimens placed Megaraptors deep within Coelurosauria, often clustering them close to Tyrannosauridea, but sometimes just outside as their own specialised branch. The problem was not only anatomical convergence, but also the weight given to different traits. In one data set, the shape of the parietal bones might tip them toward tyrannosaurs. In another, details of vertebral pneumatization pulled them closer to Allosauroids. The coding of just a few ambiguous characters could radically alter the result. By 2025, the Nature Communications paper naming Joaquinraptor casali presented what is currently the most detailed analysis. Their team tested multiple configurations, even running the data both with and without fragmentary taxa, to see how resolution changed. Both analyses suggested that Megaraptors belong within Coelurosauria, as the sister group to Tyrannosauridea, not inside Allosauridea at all. This placement gives them a halfway status. Not true tyrannosaurs, but their closest cousins, diverging early and then following their own evolutionary experiment for tens of millions of years. Yet even this, the authors cautioned, rests on the balance of character coding. The certainty is low, the support values are modest, and more fossils could still rearrange the picture. It is a humbling reminder of what paleontology really is. We are not handed a finished evolutionary tree carved into stone. We are handed scattered bones broken by time, gnawed by geology, and we try to assemble them into a coherent picture. Some branches are strong and obvious, others are brittle and sway with every new find. Megaraptors sit precisely at that point of uncertainty. Their anatomy is a patchwork that converges with multiple lineages, forcing scientists to re-examine assumptions about how traits evolve and how often they can evolve more than once. And so, rather than answering the question with finality, Megaraptors expose the limits of our reconstructions. Are they Allosauroids that stretch their tenure longer than we thought? Are they Tyrannosauroid cousins that developed an entirely different set of weapons? Or are they their own unique story within the grand Coelurosaur radiation? Each analysis sharpens some edges and blurs others, leaving us with a creature that resists simple placement. Perhaps that is the most fitting outcome. These were animals built on paradoxes, light yet strong, familiar yet strange, tyrant-like yet claw-armed, and their identity remains as elusive as the bones that first puzzled paleontologists decades ago. In the end, the Phylogeny Wars remind us of the scientific process itself. It is not a march towards certainty, but a negotiation with evidence, one fossil at a time. And maybe the real significance of Megaraptors is not where they sit on the tree, but how their shifting position teaches us humility about the fragility of all evolutionary narratives. Another dimension of the debate comes from geography. The earliest Megaraptors are found in Asia, with species like 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐼𝐿 and Megaraptor in Cretaceous Thailand. This origin complicates the story, because those early forms look closer to basal tetanurans, with fewer of the derived features seen in their South American descendants. If Megaraptors truly belong near tyrannosaurs, then their dispersal across continents must have occurred early, splitting off before tyrannosaurs themselves took over the north. If, on the other hand, they are extended Allosauroids, then South America may have preserved a long ghost lineage of predators that survived far longer in Gondwana than elsewhere. Either way, the biogeographic patterns push researchers to consider how global fragmentation of continents shaped predator lineages. Each hypothesis carries very different implications for how predators spread and diversified across the Cretaceous world. Adding to this puzzle is the role of convergent evolution. Evolution does not follow straight lines, and different groups can independently evolve the same traits when faced with similar ecological challenges. The long, narrow snout of a Megaraptor can look tyrannosaur-like, but similar elongation also appears in some Carcharodontosaurids. The pneumatic vertebrae of Joaquinraptor resemble both birdline Coelurosaurs and Allosauroid cousins. Even the hypertrophied claws, so central to their identity, are not unique to them. Other theropods in different regions exaggerated individual digits for hunting. Convergence clouds the signals in phylogenetic datasets, making it difficult to distinguish true shared ancestry from parallel solutions. The debate also illustrates the importance of fragmentary fossils in shaping entire narratives. For years, Megaraptors were known primarily from claws, vertebrae, and partial limb bones. The interpretation of these isolated pieces often dictated where the entire clade was placed. A single misinterpreted feature could ripple outward and reposition the entire group on the evolutionary tree. With Joaquinraptor, scientists finally gained a broader set of bones: skull, ribs, forelimbs, hind limbs, providing more cross-comparable traits. Yet even here, preservation is incomplete, and certain features remain open to interpretation. It is a scientific game of mosaics where missing tiles can change the picture, and so the story of Megaraptors is as much about methodology as about the dinosaurs themselves. Phylogenetic analysis is a tool, not a verdict. Different weighting schemes, inclusion or exclusion of fragmentary taxa, and coding strategies can all yield different topologies. This is not a failure of science, but its essence. Hypotheses tested, challenged, and revised. Megaraptors happen to sit at a crossroads where many lines of theropod evolution converge, forcing scientists to confront the limits of classification. They remind us that nature's history does not always fit neatly into the boxes we try to draw. Perhaps the deeper lesson is that evolutionary trees are themselves evolving, not in nature, but in our reconstructions of it. Megaraptors keep moving because the evidence is still unfolding. Far from being a weakness, this fluidity is the very strength of paleontology, a discipline that thrives not on certainty, but on the careful weaving of possibilities from fragments of stone. The world Joaquinraptor walked through in the waning years of the Cretaceous was not a lush jungle or endless swamp. It was a land where climate had begun to show sharp edges, alternating between periods of rainfall and stretches of dryness. The rocks of Patagonia, specifically the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 formation, where Joaquinraptor's bones were entombed, preserved not only fossils but also the chemical traces of the climate that sculpted this environment. Paleontology, the study of fossil pollen grains and spores, tells us about the plants that thrived there, and, by extension, the kind of climate that supported them. When scientists sifted through the sediments, they found evidence of warm conditions punctuated by seasonal rainfall. These were not constant rainforests, but landscapes where water arrived in cycles, perhaps leaving long dry months when rivers shrank and plants withered. Clay minerals extracted from the same deposits add another layer to the story. Their chemical makeup records the weathering of soils under different climatic regimes. Analyses of these clays indicate that by the late Maastrichtian, the region of central Patagonia was trending towards semi-arid conditions. Earlier in the formation, signs point to an already seasonally dry climate, but toward the top, closer to the time of Joaquinraptor, the data suggest warming with seasonal moisture rather than outright aridity. This means Joaquinraptor lived in a place that alternated between greener intervals when vegetation and prey were abundant, and harsher phases where drought might have tested both predator and prey. What does such a climate mean for a large predator? For one, it would have shaped the distribution of herbivores. Titanosaurs, the giant sauropods of Patagonia, would have followed water sources, concentrating around rivers and floodplains when dry seasons hit. That concentration, in turn, offered predators like Joaquinraptor opportunities, a bottleneck of prey animals forced into smaller areas. But it also meant risk. If prey populations declined during prolonged dry intervals, predators would have had to roam farther or scavenge more often to survive. The crocodiliform bone found between Joaquinraptor's jaws suddenly makes ecological sense in this context. Crocodile-like animals were tied to the wetter habitats, and when drought shrank waterways, they may have been more vulnerable, becoming opportunistic meals for large theropods. The seasonal climate would also have affected vegetation cover. Palynological records show alternating signals of plants adapted to wetter conditions and those suited for dryness. In practice, this means Joaquinraptor's world was patchy. Open woodlands, riverine forests, and stretches of scrubland would have created a mosaic environment. For a predator with agility and long, grasping arms, such patchwork habitats offered hunting advantages. Ambushes could be staged in denser cover, while open flats provided space to pursue smaller prey. Unlike the heavily forested habitats imagined for some earlier dinosaurs, this was a place of ecological contrasts, a world on the edge of drought where adaptability mattered. It is tempting to see these climate shifts as foreshadowing the catastrophe to come. But even without the asteroid, life in Patagonia at the end of the Cretaceous was already under stress from changing conditions. Seasonal climates create instability, and instability drives evolution. The Megaraptors, with their peculiar mix of tyrant-like skulls and long, grasping arms, may have been one of the evolutionary answers to this unstable world. They were predators designed for versatility, able to tackle a range of prey in environments that demanded flexibility. And yet, their very existence reminds us how fragile such adaptations can be. Climate left its mark in clay and pollen, but it also left its mark in bone, in the bodies of the animals that lived and died there. What remains uncertain is just how resilient these ecosystems were in the face of drying trends. Did the seasonal rainfall allow just enough reprieve for populations to recover each year? Or did the landscape gradually tip toward harsher conditions that strained herbivores, and by extension, their predators? The fossil record can only hint at answers. But when we trace pollen under a microscope or analyse the chemistry of clays, we are not simply cataloguing data. We are trying to hear the rhythms of ancient rainfall, to understand how a predator like Joaquinraptor navigated a world that was already in flux before the asteroid sealed its fate. The evidence from paleontology also lets us glimpse the finer texture of these shifting landscapes. Fossil pollen grains are tiny time capsules, often only a few microns across, yet they record the waxing and waning of plant communities with remarkable clarity. In the uppermost Maastrichtian layers of the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 Formation, the diversity of pollen suggests mixed environments where drought-tolerant plants thrived, alongside wetter-loving ferns and conifers. Such a mixture tells us rainfall was not absent, only inconsistent. Cycles of abundance and scarcity would have rippled outward through the ecosystem. Herbivores relying on lush foliage would have flourished in good years and struggled when the rains failed, and predators would have felt those fluctuations in the strength or weakness of their prey base. In semi-arid ecosystems today, large animals often congregate around waterholes during dry periods, creating high-density zones of activity. It is reasonable to imagine that the great Titanosaurs of Patagonia and the smaller herbivores they shared the landscape with behaved similarly. Those seasonal gatherings would have shaped predator behaviour. A Joaquinraptor could patrol these choke points where thirsty animals came to drink, much like lions wait at rivers in present-day Africa. But that same concentration of life also made survival precarious. If droughts were too long or too severe, the gatherings might collapse into scenes of scarcity and death, with predators forced into scavenging more frequently. The ecological record hints that opportunism, the ability to switch between hunting and scavenging, was not a rare behaviour, but a survival necessity. Climatic stress also leaves imprints in geology beyond pollen and clay. Sedimentary structures in the 𝐓𝐈𝐌𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐒 beds show alternations between floodplain deposits and layers that suggest soil hardening during dry intervals. This sedimentary rhythm reflects a pulsing world, where wet seasons brought floods and vegetation booms, followed by dry phases when riverbeds contracted and soils baked. For a predator adapted to agility and versatility, such rhythmic instability might have been both challenge and opportunity. Hunting strategies, migratory patterns, and even growth rates of dinosaurs could have been tuned to these seasonal beats. The subtlety here is important. Patagonia was not a desert in the way we picture Sahara dunes today, nor was it a permanent wetland. It was something in between, a landscape defined by change. That shifting baseline shaped the final generations of Megaraptors, creatures whose survival hinged on adaptability in a climate that was never entirely predictable. This paints a picture of resilience, but also of fragility. A world that asked its predators to adjust year by year was also a world that could unravel quickly when change arrived too abruptly. The asteroid may have been the final blow, but climate had already set the stage, carving uncertainty into the very bones that we now recover from the dust. 66 million years ago, a day arrived that no predator could anticipate and no adaptation could withstand. In what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, a rock from space struck Earth with such force that it released the energy of billions of nuclear weapons in an instant. The Chicxulub impactor was around 10 kilometers wide, a size that sounds modest when compared to the planet itself, but the physics of such a collision make words like modest meaningless. Travelling faster than a bullet, it slammed into shallow seas, vaporised rock, and hurled molten debris halfway across the globe. Within minutes, shockwaves rippled through the crust, earthquakes tore apart coastlines, and tsunamis roared across oceans. For the Megaraptors of Patagonia, the first signs of catastrophe may have been the sky itself. Eyewitnesses, if any human eyes could have seen it, would have looked upward and watched fire spread across the heavens. Ejecta from the impact re-entered the atmosphere, turning air friction into a global broiler. The surface of Earth may have heated enough to ignite vegetation on a continental scale. In some regions, animals would have perished within hours, not from the strike itself, but from the fallout of burning skies. But the true killer was not the immediate firestorm. It was the aftermath, the cascade of environmental collapse that followed. Dust, soot, and vaporized rock filled the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight. For months, perhaps years, the planet shivered in darkness. Photosynthesis collapsed, plant life faltered, and ecosystems built on primary productivity unraveled from the bottom up. For an apex predator like Joaquinraptor, extinction came not because of weakness, but because of strength. Predators sit at the top of food chains, and when those chains snap below, there is nothing left to support them. We do not know whether Joaquinraptor or its kin survived the first few days, stalking among the charred landscapes and dying rivers. It is possible some endured weeks or months after the impact, scavenging carcasses of Dinosaurs or crocodiles, clinging to existence as the world grew colder and darker. But in a collapsing ecosystem, size and specialization become liabilities. Large bodies require more food, more energy, more stability, and in the late Maastrichtian, there was suddenly none of that to be found. The record in Patagonia is silent on those final days. We find bones, but not the story of their last breath. Yet when we hold the fossil of a predator like Joaquinraptor, we know we are looking at one of the last of its kind, a lineage that stretched back nearly 70 million years only to vanish in geological seconds. The asteroid did not discriminate. It ended Tyrannosaurs in the north, Carcharodontosaurs already lingering in Africa, and Megaraptors in the south. It was not a battle lost, but a world erased. What lingers is the stark truth of extinction. Even the most fearsome predators, armed with claws, teeth, and intelligence, could not survive a planetary reset. Life endured, but not theirs. In the southern hemisphere, the impact's reach was no less devastating, though its expression may have been uneven. Patagonia, with its floodplains and semi-arid mosaics, would not have been immune to global cooling and the collapse of plant productivity. Yet the details of how the crisis unfolded there are still pieced together from pollen, clay and bones locked in mudstone. Some records suggest a staggered pattern of extinction across South America, hinting that a few groups lingered slightly longer than others. This does not lessen the scale of the collapse, but reminds us that extinction is rarely instantaneous. It is a process that can echo for decades, even centuries, as survivors struggle and then vanish one by one. For the Megaraptors, these echoes could have meant brief windows where their claws and agility still had use. As herds of Titanosaurs dwindled, perhaps they turned to scavenging. As crocodile populations thinned, maybe they tested smaller prey, or clashed with each other in shrinking territories. But the physics of survival were against them. Without a reliable base of herbivores, any population of apex predators would quickly spiral downward. Unlike small mammals or burrowing reptiles, they could not retreat underground or subsist on seeds and insects. Their size and energy demands tethered them to a stability that no longer existed. It is tempting to imagine an individual Joaquinraptor, one of the last of its line, standing in a barren river valley as the sky dimmed and the air chilled. Perhaps it still hunted, still raised its head at the scent of prey, still carried the instincts honed across millions of years. Yet the world it had mastered was gone. Its adaptations, the long forelimbs, the deadly claws, the bird-like skeleton, were perfect for a thriving Cretaceous Patagonia, but useless against a dead sky and a starving Earth. What followed was not silence, but transformation. In the ashes of the dinosaurs, new players took the stage. Mammals, once small and nocturnal, diversified. Birds, descended from theropods themselves, carried forward a fraction of the legacy of their reptilian cousins. The extinction was both an ending and a handover, a brutal pruning of life's tree that opened space for different branches to grow. Joaquinraptor did not know this, of course. No creature could. But in the randomness of survival, its disappearance made room for lineages that would one day produce us. The asteroid story is one of violence, but also of perspective. To stand at the fossil bed and trace the outline of Joaquinraptor's claw is to touch a predator undone not by failure, but by cosmic chance. That lesson is sobering, and perhaps comforting too. Even the fiercest rulers are temporary, and the only permanence is change itself. When the dust finally began to settle after the impact, the world looked nothing like the one Joaquinraptor had known. Forests were reduced to charred remnants, river systems clogged with debris, skies dimmed by atmospheric soot, and food chains broken from the bottom up. Yet not everything perished. Some creatures found ways, by design or by chance, to slip through the bottleneck of extinction. Among them were the ancestors of modern birds. Their survival, when compared to the disappearance of giant predators like megaraptors, is a question that has haunted paleontology for decades. What separated the lineages that vanished from those that endured? One of the clearest answers lies in body size. The birds that survived were small, most no larger than a pigeon. Smallness comes with advantages in times of scarcity. A small animal requires less food and can more easily find niches of survival in devastated ecosystems. The megaraptors, towering at 7 meters or more, had energy demands impossible to meet in a world where herbivores had collapsed. They were built for abundance, not deprivation. The same landscape that supported a predator of that scale in the lush late Cretaceous became a trap when resources vanished. Flight added another advantage. Birds could move across long distances in search of food or refuge, even in fragmented environments. A megaraptor might pace the edge of a dying floodplain, but it was tethered to its body and the ground it walked on. Birds could range out, exploit temporary resources, and find shelter in landscapes scattered with ruin. Even species unable to travel far had the capacity to hop between microhabitats, squeezing sustenance from seeds, insects, or carrion. Seeds, in fact, may have been the critical factor. Fossil evidence suggests that seed-eating birds were among the most successful survivors. Seeds are durable, able to remain viable through months of darkness and cold when green plants have withered. Birds with beaks capable of cracking or swallowing seeds had a portable food source in a time when nothing else grew. By contrast, megaraptors relied on active prey, and when that web collapsed, so did their chances. Metabolism also played its role. Birds inherited the high-energy, fast-paced physiology of their theropod ancestors but scaled it down to a form that could function under pressure. Their rapid reproductive cycles allowed populations to rebound quickly when conditions stabilized. A megaraptor, maturing over nearly 2 decades, could not recover from a population crash. Even if a few survived the immediate aftermath, their lineages were too slow to rebuild. The irony is striking. The descendants of small, feathered dinosaurs carried the legacy forward, while the giants, with all their predatory brilliance, were erased. It was not strength, intelligence, or dominance that mattered in the long run, but flexibility, diet, and scale. Birds walked away from the edge of extinction not because they were superior, but because they fit through a narrow doorway that the giants could not. Their songs today, drifting from trees across every continent, are faint echoes of a time when their larger cousins ruled the earth and then disappeared in fire and ash. Another factor in the survival of birds was behavioural plasticity. In modern ecosystems, birds are among the most adaptable vertebrates, often thriving in disturbed or human-altered environments, where larger, more specialised animals vanish. This tendency may have deep evolutionary roots. After the asteroid impact, when landscapes were stripped bare, birds able to switch quickly between food sources, seeds, insects, carrion, even aquatic invertebrates, would have had an enormous advantage. Megaraptors, by contrast, were finely tuned predators. Their claws and long forelimbs were perfect for overpowering large prey, but ill-suited for improvisation when those prey animals no longer existed. Nesting strategies may also have played a role. Small ground nesting birds could produce multiple clutches in a short span, ensuring that even if some offspring failed, others might succeed when conditions improved. Dinosaurs like Joaquinraptor laid eggs too. but their reproductive investment was slower, their clutches fewer, and their young far more vulnerable in an unstable world. A predator's offspring require not just hatching, but the survival of parents capable of bringing down large prey. Without that foundation, whole broods would have failed together. There is also the matter of shelter. Fossil and geological evidence suggests that many early birds occupied margins of rivers, lakes, and wetlands. These environments, though stressed, may have offered temporary refuges where food chains were buffered by aquatic systems. Fish, insects, and seeds along the water's edge could sustain small, quick-breeding species. A large land predator like Joaquinraptor could not retreat into such narrow, ecological spaces. The very flexibility that made birds unassuming in the Cretaceous allowed them to become global survivors in the Paleogene. What is most remarkable is that survival was not inevitable even for them. Most bird lineages still perished in the catastrophe. Only a handful, probably less than 10% of late Cretaceous diversity, crossed into the Paleogene. Those few carried the genetic seeds of every sparrow, eagle, and penguin alive today. When we listen to birdsong in the modern world, we are listening to survivors of one of the most severe trials life has ever faced. Megaraptors, meanwhile, left nothing but stone impressions. Their story is no less important, for extinction is as fundamental to evolution as survival. The disappearance of giants created space for the flourishing of smaller, more adaptable creatures. In a sense, Joaquinraptor and its kin gave way to the ancestors of the birds we know, their ecological absence making possible an avian future. It is humbling to realize that what separates extinction from endurance is often not power or intelligence, but the quirks of ecology, body size, and timing. The silence of extinction does not end with the last heartbeat of a predator like Joaquinraptor. It lingers in stone, in fragments, in the broken record of a world long gone. When modern paleontologists go into the field in Patagonia or elsewhere, they are not digging up intact monsters. They are uncovering hints, pieces of bone weathered from an outcrop, splinters of teeth, sometimes just impressions pressed into rock. To assemble a life from those fragments is less like discovery and more like detective work, one that requires patience, technology, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. The process begins in the field, often under punishing conditions. Teams trek across dry scrub or muddy badlands, eyes scanning the ground for subtle colour changes, textures, or the glint of fossilised bone. A claw tip eroding from the soil may be all that announces the presence of a buried skeleton. Excavation is careful, almost meditative. Brushes, chisels, and plaster jackets protect bones that have lain undisturbed for tens of millions of years. Each discovery is recorded with meticulous notes on its position, its orientation, and the layers of rock that encase it. Without that context, the fossil itself loses much of its meaning. Once the bones reach the lab, the silence of deep time is interrogated with tools unimaginable to the first paleontologists. Thin slices of bone are cut and polished for histological study, revealing growth rings like those in trees. These microscopic patterns whisper of age, growth rates, and pauses in development. CT scans allow scientists to peer inside fossilized skulls, reconstructing brain cavities, sinuses, and sensory structures. Even fragments too fragile to remove from rock can be digitally imaged, creating virtual skeletons that can be compared and tested. And yet, for all this technology, the fossil record is profoundly incomplete. A Joaquinraptor skeleton, no matter how unusually complete, still tells only part of the story. Soft tissues, muscles, skin, organs almost never preserve. Behaviours leave even fainter traces. Did they hunt in packs, stalk alone, or scavenge opportunistically? Bones do not answer these questions directly. They leave scientists to infer, to build models, to argue and revise. The silence of the fossil record is not a failure of science, but its very canvas. There is a humility in this process. Each fossil is both revelation and reminder of what we will never fully know. Paleontology is a science of patience, where progress is measured not in answers but in narrowing uncertainties. The silence may never break completely, but with every fragment pulled from the earth, every scan, every analysis, we hear a little more of the echoes of lives that ended long ago. Even when fossils make it safely from the field into the lab, they carry with them the distortions of time. Compression, mineral replacement, and erosion bend and twist the original anatomy, forcing paleontologists to reconstruct what is missing. A femur flattened under layers of sediment is not just a bone, but a puzzle of stresses, pressures, and fractures that must be mentally reversed. Software now allows for digital retrodeformation, restoring warped fossils to their probable original shapes. But probable is the operative word. Each reconstruction is an interpretation, one that can change with new comparisons or new technology. What we see in museum mounts or digital reconstructions is never the unfiltered past, but a best estimate that lives within a framework of uncertainty. The silence also extends to entire gaps in the fossil record. There are places where erosion has stripped away the right layers, or where sedimentation never preserved bones in the first place. For Megaraptors, this is especially frustrating. Their evolutionary path stretches across continents and tens of millions of years, but the record comes to us in flashes: a claw here, a rib there, and only rarely a partial skeleton. Each new discovery, like Joaquinraptor, is disproportionately valuable because it illuminates stretches of evolutionary history otherwise left in darkness. Yet each fossil also reminds us how much is missing, how much of deep time is still buried or lost forever. Fieldwork, too, is not a guarantee of discovery. Many expeditions return with little more than fragments, or the absence of fossils in certain formations, which is still data but not the kind that draws headlines. To persist in this work requires not only scientific training, but also a certain philosophy. The acceptance that progress is incremental and that silence is part of the record. A fossil bed is as much about what it does not preserve as what it does, and still, from this patchwork, we learn. Stable isotope analysis can tell us about the climate in which a dinosaur grew. Microscopic wear on teeth hints at diets otherwise invisible. Even the sediments around a fossil can preserve pollen, spores, or chemical traces that reconstruct the environment. Each technique chips away at the silence, layering context on fragmentary bones. In this sense, paleontology is not so much about breaking silence as about learning to listen carefully to its faintest echoes. The act of digging giants from the earth is therefore not simply about recovering spectacular skeletons. It is about translating whispers of stone into stories of life. The silence will never be fully broken, but each new discovery pushes back against it, allowing us to hear, however faintly, the lives of creatures who once walked in worlds long gone. In the end, what remains of Joaquinraptor is not its strength, nor the fear it inspired in its prey, nor the sharpness of its claws. What remains is silence, and within that silence a trace, a clawprint pressed into the fabric of time, carried forward not in flesh but in stone. We call it a predator, an apex hunter of Patagonia, but those are our words layered onto a life that never knew such labels. For Joaquinraptor, existence was immediate. Hunger, movement, the rhythm of breath in a drying world. For us, looking back 66 million years later, existence is memory, reconstructed through fragments, uncertain and imperfect. That is the strange intimacy of paleontology. We know these creatures not as they knew themselves, but as echoes distorted by time, each fossil both presence and absence, both discovery and loss. When the last Megaraptor vanished, nothing marked the moment. No elegy played across the floodplains, no voice acknowledged the end. The world simply moved forward, as it always does, reshaping itself into new forms of life. Yet to us, their disappearance is heavy with meaning. Extinction reminds us that survival is never guaranteed, that dominance in one era guarantees nothing in the next. The claws that once defined power now sit behind glass, powerless, yet still carrying weight. They speak not of conquest, but of fragility, of how easily entire worlds can be undone. What we lose with the vanishing of a predator is not only ecological balance, but also imagination. To imagine Joaquinraptor moving across its territory, breathing the air of a Cretaceous Patagonia sky, is to glimpse a reality beyond our own. These reconstructions stretch our minds, teaching us that life has taken countless shapes before and will take countless shapes again. We lose uniqueness when a species is gone, but we also gain perspective. We are reminded that nothing in nature is permanent, not even us. Perhaps that is why these fossils comfort as much as they unsettle. They remind us that we're not the first to stand on this earth and believe the world belongs to us. Giants walked before us and fell into silence. Their bones, found by chance and studied with care, invite us into a kind of humility. They tell us survival is less about strength than about circumstance, less about control than about adaptation, and they whisper that extinction, while tragic, is also part of the endless reshaping of life. So as we close the story of Joaquinraptor, the last Megaraptor, we are left not with fear, but with calm reflection. The clawprint fades into the sand, the predator into history. What remains is our responsibility to listen to these echoes and to let them remind us of the fleeting, fragile, and extraordinary gift of existence. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.